Welcome everybody to the Imperial 80s, which is a collaboration. I'm gonna bring Mtume right to the stage actually, because it's a collaborative effort here. It's good to be with you this morning. Obviously folks are watching on the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism live stream. We'll be doing this in audio podcasts on Within Our Gates. And so Mtume will release those probably. I don't know the timing of that, but we'll try to do, one a week basically. And we're typically going to do these on Tuesdays. The timing may shift a little bit because it's 7 a.m. out on the West Coast, and we do want to have some folks come through from out there. We're obviously going to have a lot of guests, like people who next week, we can plug next week's already. We have Hiram Rivera that's going to join us to talk about the movie Nighthawks, which people may not be as familiar with, but if it's Hiram, you're gonna come through and enjoy it. And so yeah, it's a collaborative effort. Mtume, do you want to say a little bit about it, and we can start this discussion today?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot to get to, but just first, very happy to be doing this. This is an idea that I had, and one of the things I do with within our gates is I always like try to bring my friends with me to like talk about movies, but my friends who have good political concepts. So I was like, making short lists, and then you, Jared, I started like throwing up, you got to jump on this, and then when you said you were willing to take the whole ride with me, I was like, okay, well then, yeah, because this will be an interesting revisit of a lot of our youth and our upbringings and the kind of ideology that we were raised on and, somewhat formed by and that we had to deconstruct and get rid of and may still have vestiges of it within us when we don't even realize or more of it than we would like to admit. So yeah, I'm really excited to be taking this dive. This is a something that I've been really wanting to do, and yeah, in company, it's much better.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think we should talk a little bit before we start to get into the movie as
Yeah,
to like what do we mean by the Imperial 80s? Like what are we talking about with imperialism? What are we talking about with this decade? And so I'll just say a couple of things and we can go back and forth. But I mean, one, it is my childhood. So there is a part of this. I was born in 81, so a lot of the movies of the 80s that we'll talk about, like I didn't see when they first came out, but 90s culture was also like blockbuster time too. So like you watched a lot of these movies later. Some of them I did see as they came out in the theater, but a lot of them I saw like either on TV or in renting them when I was growing up. And also I had peers that got to see stuff that I didn't get to see too. And that was like a thing at school, and that we'll talk a little bit about the dynamics of that as we get into it, of like what would your parents let you see and what wouldn't they let you see in the 80s. I think is a really interesting period for that conversation. um Imperialism, obviously, like we kind of, I think we can each offer our thoughts, but so Lenin has the idea of it as basically the expression of monopoly capitalism, right? And monopoly capitalism on a global dimension. Amin basically says like capitalism is actually always imperialist. It actually was imperialist even before you had the rise of monopolies, but you could still talk about what is that monopoly capitalism represents a kind of new phase of how it looks. And as we talked about within our, long conversation about forgeries of memory and meaning, Hollywood has a really important role, even from the beginning, in you know, creating images and mythologies, right, that connect to obviously capitalist exploitation and capitalist exploitation on a kind of global scale within the world system, within the rising United States empire, right? Which I think we can really talk about, especially coming, kind of on the heels of World War I, definitely on the heels of World War II, right? Um, and but with that, like you need ideology, you need certain politics, right? So there have to be otherwise people would oppose it. People would say, well, why am I fighting in these wars? Why do I, and that's the other part, is you need military, right? These are the sort of two legs, as you have, like, again, you borrow from Samir Amin, you have kind of the political economic aspects of imperialism, the ways that you are extracting, but then you need the military component, because if somebody says, no, I'm going to go my own way and do my own thing, you need sanctions and you need guns, basically, and we see that obviously playing out again in our world right now, um, and consistently. But the 80s is a really interesting period in regards to that too. And partly, as we'll talk about today, it's also about how does America deal with Vietnam, in the hindsight of a loss of a war that is an imperialist war. The other point, I guess I would just say quickly, and I'll pass it over to you, is just the anti-communism also of the period, being the last full decade of the Cold War before the Soviet Union's, unfortunate retreat into, like, neoliberal capitalism and the kind of breakup of the Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc. China also taking more of a market-based road, although China has continued to maintain a communist party and has continued to try to figure out, how do we preserve our project at all costs, right? And so those are some of the interesting things. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said there. I mean, I definitely align with the Lenin kind of thought, monopoly capital, right? How you create a monopoly and like the unipolar power of the US. So the ideology is necessary to kind of justify the acts. I think the 80s are very interesting. I think the Vietnam thing, while it will be specific to Rambo, I think there's a broad kind of color to it because of that loss, right? And I'll probably a little bit after this, I'll talk about New Hollywood and like the New Hollywood era of movies that went from the late 60s. And Rambo is really a transition film out of New Hollywood. It has some of the vestiges, and we'll talk about that. But the reason why I bring that up is because there was a certain narrative that happened in the 70s, very nihilistic, very pessimistic view of the U.S., right, and of single man within the kind of world. They embraced a kind of nihilistic or ponderous viewing of the Western subjects, right, in these movies, right, from Taxi Driver, so forth and so on. But by the 80s, and one of the interesting things I had read, and I forgot who had said this, was I think hindsight's always weird because, like, we know the Soviet Union to be something that eventually fell, but it wasn't something that America or even the world predicted. Maybe within the Soviet Union, they were like, this probably only has so many years left. But I'm sure there was also people who were quite shocked. There's actually a lot of people who were quite shocked by it. But by the 80s, because of that loss in Vietnam and the Soviet Union was still going, there was this need. America had to increase its drive, its narrative towards, and towards a kind of anti-communist and hyper-imperialist and justifying imperialism within culture, within movies, within mass media. And things like Rambo and these movies and the kind of formation that they take really exemplify it. And when you take the tour through it, it gets very interesting. You begin to really realize, like, wow, how much they kind of went full on the gas in really, expressing this. And one of the interesting things is, and a teacher told me this many years ago, they said that, like, look, the 50s gets lauded as like the era of anti-communism, and he's like, the fifth in movies, the 50s have nothing on the 80s, like nothing on the 80s, right? The 80s is absolutely the hallmark of it. And not just anti-communism, really anti-Islamic. We'll get to that in a lot of the movies, anti-Arab, anybody that was fighting off imperialism, and then even things within the core, how they look at the criminal, the person who is, carceral, who's been caught by that, like how they look at those people. This is all a part of a project. So while some of the films might not like directly be about a military force, you'll see within it, and hopefully within the conversations that we have, how it still is a part of this ideological project.
100%. And that was one of our conversations as we were doing this. Like at first, I think we laid out a lot of like military related films, because of the military aspect of imperialism. But as we were doing it, we were, and people have said, like, you got to do Back to the Future, right? And we hadn't even talked about that yet, but we do, right? And so there's like a lot of films when you start to think about it that, it's like, and that's just part of this too, again, like going back to our childhoods, right? It's like also a practice, I feel like, of, again, like, to borrow from Jared Ball and what he was talking about last week on the Donald Duck conversations, like, how do we how do we know that we like the things that we like, right? And sort of, and there's just a lot of, so it's a part of deconstructing our own liberalism, right? The own things within us where it's like, okay, I like that, which I'll say today, like the movie we're doing today, I liked it a lot and I still like it, but doing this project and reviewing it in the way that we have over the last week or so, I'm like, oh, there's some stuff about it that where I still understand what I like about it and what I like. And because I like it, I probably also am letting certain messages within it get through, even if I don't fully believe them, right? Where it's shaping a certain understanding, right, about like what Vietnam was, what the experience of veterans was with Vietnam, and all of that, which is really interesting, especially because, as we'll get to, one of the books I'm going to reference throughout this conversation is this book called Spitting Image. Um, Rambo and this movie in particular, First Blood, is a part of a curation of certain images out of Vietnam. And I think it's interesting. Maybe it's something we could say as we start to talk a little bit about the film. Unless there's anything, is there anything else you want to get to before we go
The
there?
one thing I mean, it'll probably tie up, but to kind of talk about new Hollywood and kind of this
Sure.
how this Hollywood went to. So the phrase new Hollywood, I mean, might sound weird because you have to think about Hollywood historically. So in like the 60s, you had the studio system, which we all know, but you had a certain era of the studio system where movies were heavily controlled in the studios, shot on lots mostly, things like that. Not a lot of on location shooting. There were some films that happened like that, but they weren't like a big thing. By the 60s, for multiple reasons, some of it is like social turmoil of the 60s. Movie studios hit a financial strain moment. Some of them even closed down their lots, and some of that shut down their doors. But the movies didn't die. But they had to reform, especially as like the 60s were happening in Vietnam and things were happening around the death of Dr. King, Malcolm X, protests in the street. They were like, well, look, the movies we were making then don't really work. We need to let some of these young bloods in here. And also we take the reins off of things like violence, so forth and so on. So one of the very first movies is a movie that people probably will recognize as Bonnie and Clyde. It's considered to be one of the very first, if not the first, new Hollywood movies. People have a lot of debates. There's another film called Point Blank, with which I love actually. I quite really like that movie with Lee Marvin, and where they begin to also incorporate European styles, things from from Asia, mainly Japan, in the filmmaking. Also develop like new narratives around like lone drifters, which gets very interesting for Rambo. Pessimistic endings. Movies like Five Easy Pieces is one of the very first movies where like Jack Nicholson just walks away. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He's killed at the end of it. These kinds of pessimistic and nihilistic kind of believing that, things aren't going to turn. So you have that go throughout the 70s, and it's considered by many to be the great artistic period of American movies. But in 77, you have a very, very, very big movie called Star Wars. And Star Wars changes a lot, right? Because you get the advent of the new blockbuster, right? And this begins to kind of change Hollywood a bit, which is also interesting. And we'll get to this in Rambo. Around 77, you have that. And then you also have the beginning of some kind of Vietnam movies. You get Coming Home, which we'll talk about, Apocalypse Now. Another thing that we didn't mention in our text is Taxi Driver and the fact that he is a Vietnam vet. And I think that's actually very informative for this film. So by like the end of the 70s and the early 80s, new Hollywood begins to kind of die as the market changes, and then also the political needs change, right? There needs to be a Vietnam, the big imperialist loss that happens to the US. They kind of need to change the narrative of what's happening. So new Hollywood is done by the early 80s. People don't really have an exact year, but Rambo, which is 81, is kind of one of those films where you're seeing some of the vestiges of new Hollywood style, but definitely the 80s level of approach and ideology is really beginning to kick in, and you see this change kind of happening.
Right on. So you mentioned Taxi Driver. I don't know if you mentioned Deer Hunter, but
Deer Hunter,
that's
I forgot.
So that one of the things that's really interesting, right, is that the Vietnam War is not a war that obviously it's very unpopular war, right? And so there's a huge anti-war movement. There's a draft that's unpopular. A lot of draft resistance goes on that also fuels the anti-war movement. Campuses are literally ablaze. ROTC offices are like burned. Like all of this stuff is going on, and um, it's also unpopular among people who serve in it, right? And so there's also there's all these instances of fragging, right? People shooting their superior officers, um, experience a lot of desertion that goes on during the Vietnam War. Um, and so there's a lot to it. It's complicated, and obviously ultimately the United States decides, well, it shouldn't they lost, right? Like they do decide to withdraw, but they lose the war. And we can have the debate about, okay, well, they killed 2 million Vietnamese and they pulverized this country, and so in certain ways it can a loss can still be sort of a win in certain ways for US empire, but nonetheless they lost. Like their goal was to have a pro-capitalist Vietnam that was in the orbit of the US camp, and they get a communist Vietnam that's nationally independent and clearly not, right? And so in that sense, they absolutely lost the war. And Hollywood doesn't know how to deal with this, which really means that like the ruling class is not sure what kinds of narratives. And I think this contributes actually to what you're talking about in this vibe of 70s film as well, the pessimism, the kind of like psychological sort of films that you get. I love films from the 70s, by the way. But it's this era where there's also Watergate, there's everything else that's going on in the 70s, right? So there's a huge distrust in government. There's the reveal of like COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, like all of these things come out. And so there's an understanding by people in the 70s of like, oh, there's a lot of messed up stuff our government's doing. That's also reflected in film, which is why it's such an interesting period to me, because it's one of the few periods where you get a good amount of film that's kind of paranoid and distrustful of the state and the US government and so on. This film is really interesting. So I guess one thing I'd say is there's not throughout the 70s, there's very few films about Vietnam. There is Coming Home, there is Deer Hunter, there is Taxi Driver. So you get a few representations of veterans and things like this. But it is not the 80s is the period where we actually get a lot of Vietnam film. And a lot of that has to do with they had to figure out narratives that would kind of land and be able give a space nationally where there could be conversations that were conversations that also like both resonated with people. I think that's an important thing. Like this film and Rambo in particular, like clearly resonates on some level. And so I think it's important to like deal with that. But also it resonates in a certain way with Empire, with Capital, where they're like, yeah, these are images that we're good with like promoting, monetizing, etc. Right. And so one of the things we'll talk about as we go through this film is like what within it does that. Like how does it land there, and like, what is important about the character of John Rambo, and how it does embody certain real issues coming out of Vietnam, and then also participates in this like kind of myth making. And it's not, I don't want to use the term moral panic, but there's a way with moral panics where there's like a consensus building around a certain reality that's not really true. Like it's a mythology that you're then trying to create as a real narrative, right? And so that's one of the big things that goes on with this film, which again, as a kid, was not something I understood, right? So as a kid, the first time I saw this, I remember my father showing it to me and being like, well, yeah, like Rambo movies are crap, right? Because as we'll get into later on, like they get like, I think Rambo, the second one and the third one are like really heavy propaganda, and also like this weird kind of like action hero film, right? Which is a big thing in the 80s. And we'll talk about that a lot too. Whereas the first one is a more nuanced film, and it has some like really interesting elements to it as a movie where you could actually like look at it and say, well, there's some stuff going on here. So anyways, yeah, I've talked enough, but go ahead.
No, right on. I mean, so we could probably start to get into like the how the movie was made a little bit, because one of the things in like I think the research Jay and I both did was, Vietnam was a subject that was talked about, but like it was always really decontextualized in the 60s and the 70s. So you had a lot of pulp novels I had read about Vietnam, but they were actually a lot like Rambo, about a guy who comes back from the war. They didn't always do like the super tortured. I think the First Blood novel is the one that really do like the super tortured person, but it was more like the Green Beret comes back. He worked it out in Vietnam, so now he has to go clean up a community. They have books like that, like wild stuff in the 60s and the 70s. And these novelizations are something that they played with in the kind of the pulp um, counterculture zeitgeist that was happening in the 60s through the 70s. And right, so Coming Home, is a movie by Hal Ashby, made by Jane Fonda specifically. That was actually Jane Fonda's project. She found Hal Ashby. He was willing to work on it. Stars John Voight. I think he won an Oscar for it. He plays a paraplegic Vietnam vet, and her husband's in Nam. It's like a social drama, right? Right. And then The Deer Hunter, which is a movie that I think Rambo and have a lot of sharing with, especially in its depiction of the Vietnamese. You kind of have to take a pick of which one is worse. If someone said which one is more horrible, I wouldn't argue. They're both pretty abhorrent, right? One, because there's so much of it in The Deer Hunter at a moment, and probably in Rambo because they're so interspersed, and we'll talk about it, right? And then Apocalypse Now. And Apocalypse Now is another film that's interesting because it was a success that no one thought was going to happen. It was a massive, like 2, almost 3 year shoot for Coppola. It almost fell apart. And then it came out and it became this massive thing. So that really, injected an interest, because this novel, First Blood, was in like, I can't, Jared, you probably remember it better than me. It was in development hell for years as
So
a
he
as
gets,
as a film, right?
yeah, so 72 or 3, he sells the rights of it to Hollywood. It goes through a bunch of studios, a bunch of directors. Like I don't want to miscite numbers, but it's crazy amounts. I might actually have it in my notes, but it's in development hell. It has like different actors that are gonna play John Rambo. The book is quite different from the movie, and I actually think the movie's better. I haven't totally finished the book, but I've read enough of it where I actually think the the movie is a better story than the book is. Um, but they're very different. They include elements of the same story, but they're quite different. And so Stallone actually, and I think we should say a little bit about Stallone. So this is actually, I thought this was really early in Stallone's career, but it's actually not. Like Rocky 3 came out like 5 months or 4 months before this movie. So he already has really established himself through the Rocky series, which was like very much, I mean, some of this is his own kind of mythological stuff about himself, I think, but like nonetheless, he writes the first, like he's involved in writing these movies and putting himself in these roles, and he can't really make it as an actor independent of his own writing, right? So he gets involved in writing, directing, producing, like kind of his own stuff, obviously with financial support and so on, right? But he gets involved in this project at a certain point, and he actually changed. He's one of the main drivers, as he tells it, at least. Some of this is coming from the documentary Sly on Netflix, if people want to get him talking about it. But he participates in the rewriting of the film. There's actually a clip. I have to find it because I sent it to you on my phone, but where he talks about it differently in different places. But there's like a Howard Stern clip where he's talking about how how bad it was and how it was like 3 hours long, and he's doing all these silly slogans and all this stuff. So I think there's a lot of like reworking of the story, which we will get to as we go through certain parts of it that I think were different as we kind of go through it a little bit. But nonetheless, he's very instrumental in this film happening. And it also does something for his career too, because before that, he has the Rocky films, which are like at least blockbusters. And the first one was very, I mean, it won Oscar, like it was very critically acclaimed, the first one. But his other movies are really not, he's not really landing as an actor outside of the Rocky series. And then this launches him to a whole different stratosphere, because especially with the second Rambo movie, but he becomes, the toys, the action figures, we get to, there's cartoons that we end up getting with this series. There's all this kind of stuff, and we'll deal with other other Rambo products and movies later on in the series. I'm sure we're going to try to mostly stick with this film today, but it is a big film for him in kind of showing that like he can do more than one thing. At least he can have more than one character. um and Rambo becomes a big like enterprise for him, in a kind of different way, because while Rocky is very popular, it doesn't have like quite the same like merchandising and global appeal that this film ends up generating, particularly with the second one.
That's interesting because Rocky. I saw Rocky 3 on TV the other day, and one of the things that struck me is how different it is from the first two. Right? Like the first two are pretty much the same social drama back and forth, except he wins in the second one. Really, it's the same movie, but they really upplay the kind of like not being able to speak and so forth and so on. And then in Rocky 3, there's this real like attempt to make Rocky more refined, and the movie also feels more blockbustery. So you see Stallone trying to kind of show that he can be more of a leading man actor, and he can take a more demanding central role as an actor. So him wanting them to do Rambo, I totally now understand. Like, and he wrote the script, and you could see it as necessity. I definitely see probably it was as necessity for Stallone to take reins for himself. I mean, he did that with the original Rocky movie. He wrote the original script and went to John G. Avildsen and was like, yo, let's make this happen. But also Stallone is a control freak. He has a bit of a super controlling thing, because one of the things we'll get to is in studying the kind of making of this film and in an interest in how much the military was involved with these films, they weren't. He actually did a lot of this as he, kept control with Rambo as it went on, largely on his own. This wasn't a film that had tons of Pentagon influence directly. If anything, he probably called them if he needed like a clarification on something. But also, these movies are so ahistorical. He probably didn't even do that either. They're just grabbing things out the wind and making up new stuff. So they're really self-driven by Stallone, which I think is an interesting comment, that this Italian from Philly is like the ultimate patriot, which is something that I just found always really hilarious.
Yeah, and he, to that point too, one of the things I think is interesting is some of the ideological work that's happening in the film, I think is actually a result of him maybe doing a little bit of research among bad sources, right? And so this is something as well. I'll wait until we get to specific parts in the film to kind of talk about, but I think maybe that's part of what's going on, right? Which is always interesting because I think, again, to the sort of Cedric Robinson point about like how racial regimes are built, like sometimes it's people who are in a position to be a cultural worker, say like Stallone is, that participate in a certain project but don't really realize. And I want to give him some credit. I think he does understand like some of the things that he's doing. I think it's very intentional, but it's also, I think, that he has certain misunderstandings too about like history and the kind of reality of these situations, but they're not unsourced misunderstandings. And we'll kind of get to that, but like in the documentary, he cites, for instance, some bad statistics. And when you go back into the period, you realize that these bad statistics were circulating at the time. And so he still thinks that some of this shit is true, even though it's been debunked later on. And so he's like, I'm kind of writing I'm doing something based on like what's real, when in fact, like, he kind of got caught up in certain ways in certain ideas that were either a part of a myth making process or were just bad science, or somewhere in between. And anyways, I don't we'll get there. So yeah,
Yeah.
how do you want to open this up now?
So I just want to mention a couple of people that are interesting threads, and then we can like go right into the movie, or it'll help us get there. But a person who's very interesting in the 80s, his name is going to come up in a lot of movies that we do, is a guy named Mario Kassar. So Mario Kassar, he's actually still alive. He doesn't really do movies anymore. He's a Lebanese Italian producer. He did Terminator 2, Rambo. I don't know I think he does all of them, if I remember correctly. He did Total Recall, a lot of Schwarzenegger films. Showgirls is one of a film that he did. And Kassar is an interesting figure because he really invested in these kinds of films that were seen to be kind of somewhat edgy in terms of the violence and the topics, right? Big movies with lots of strong, themes around, vengeance and violence and so forth and so on. But he's not really talked about a lot. And he's actually still alive, and he's largely out of Hollywood after a pretty much going bankrupt due to a movie called Cutthroat Island. But go ahead.
Just quickly, I just want to say, so David Morrell, who's the author of the book this is based on, in his introduction, I found I had to, like, I was doing an audiobook and I had to replay it like 3 times. He refers to Kassar as someone who made his money distributing movies in the Orient, right? Like, so this is how because he worked in Hong Kong along with one of the other producers on this film, and they were distributors, and this was like their first foray into production in Hollywood. But I just thought that he wrote that in 2000, or at least it was in like, no, he did write it in 2000 because he dates it. And I just thought, like, somebody who refers to Asia as to Hong Kong, right, as the Orient in 2000, it just tells you a little bit about like the political mind also who's behind the novel, right? Which I just think is an important piece too.
100%. And like, while the novel and the film have differences, I guess there are overlaps with the source material, but also, yeah, I agree. Like, I read the introduction of the novelist, and I found him he was really interested in the novel and making this kind of fractured America thing, that, and which I always find, I always get annoyed at those ideas, the idea that the problem with America is that it can't find unity. And I think in the current moment, we understand the bullshit of that kind of narrative, right? But yeah, the kind of conservative or whatever kind of militaristic or whatever you want to say kind of mentality of the people. And then Jay, you mentioned like the people who were kind of be involved in who want possibly going to be involved in it. Al Pacino was tagged to be in the movie, to play Rambo. He ended up not doing it. He wanted to apparently make him like super crazy, which is wild. I'm thinking of like, Pacino doing all his Pacinoisms, all skinny, trying to be like the best soldier ever made, which it sounds pretty hilarious.
Yeah, I would say too, the one difference that we should say between the novel and the book is in the novel, Rambo is supposed to be totally an insane, like serial killer sort
Yeah.
of, like he just kills everybody. And it's like, obviously it's still the same of like he's a Green Beret. He's come home from Vietnam. He's trained to be this like, incredible fighter, right? Which is still in the movie. But in the book, he's so much more of a killer than Rambo is in the film, at least in First Blood, right? And so anyway, it's just one of the differences.
Yeah, and another person who was attached to it for a long time was Kirk Douglas. Um, and he turned it down because of the ending change, which I think we probably can talk to when we get to the end. But that was Kirk Douglas's big thing, because one of the other big differences of the novel and the book, and the movie, is the changing of the ending, right? And you could probably guess if you've seen the movie what the ending change will be. Go ahead, Jay.
Is also a big issue for Stallone, actually. So I bet it was probably an issue for a number of the actors, and it finally does get changed with Stallone, but he's really instrumental in it getting changed.
Yeah,
But yeah, we'll get to that.
yeah. So I guess we'll start with the movie. I mean, the movie, it's fun. I hadn't seen it in a little bit. And growing up, I actually saw two, I think, first. Rambo 2 was on cable all the time, and I watched it tons. And I was, 5, I think, when the movie came out. And um, for me, as a kid, this is one of those things that happened. My parents had a very free, open system with movie watching for me. So, yes, at 7 and 8 years old, I was watching, veiny Italians with guns, shooting up people and, killing communists and Vietnamese people. It was something that I saw regularly. And then but then I think my dad or my uncle, someone said, no, but the first Rambo movie is a really good movie. So I actually didn't see this until like the early 90s. I was older. And then I watched it, and I could see like the kind of like sentimental kind of like nature of it, and the kind of attempt to make it more of a drama of this person, this misunderstood individual. And the film, and I don't know if you have the screenshots that I pulled out. The film really starts out like I text Jay, I said, this film did not have a wide shot it did not like, right? Everything is like situating Rambo as like this centerpiece person in the world who is, he's surrounded by everything, but he is alone, right? And they make this, real attempt to kind of situate him consistently alone. Like, this is like a shot that really exemplifies the movie, kind of like center mass, right? You can see the distance behind him, right? So he's come a long road, right? He's up
The town
front.
is called Hope.
The town is called Hope. Exactly. Like they really lay it on thick. I mean, the film opens with like really like emotionally dripping music, and he's going to see a friend, to find a friend who was a fellow soldier in Vietnam, who's also and who you discover, well, you realize is black, because he goes to the family and they're black people, which I find very interesting. And they don't do much with it. I just found it interesting to start with black people in that. I mean, they don't really do much with it. I was like, but as a choice, as a casting choice, I found it interesting. And he goes and he finds out that the fellow soldier is now dead of cancer. And I can't remember, Jared, is it suggested that the cancer is related to being a nom, or is it just cancer? It is?
Yeah, no, actually, it's very interesting. So this is one of the aspects of the film that's somewhat important, I think. So they acknowledge that it's Agent Orange, and that he got cancer and he didn't even know. Which there's also a song called Agent Orange, or the Agent Orange song, that I used to listen. My parents used to play it as a kid. It was the first time I learned about it. Agent Orange, for folks who don't know, was created by Monsanto, but the way that they got out of any legal culpability is the United States gave them the specifications of, this is the crap that we want you all to make, right? And so the United States created a defoliant, right, is what it's called. So it was a way to try to break down the jungle in Vietnam, right? And to basically, it's like sort of like a mass pesticide kind of thing, um, to kill it so that you could better attack guerrillas, right? Because Vietnam is a guerrilla war, which certainly comes through in this movie. And it's extremely carcinogenic and toxic. And so a bunch of Vietnam vets get cancer from the United States government, spreading this defoliant all over. Not to mention, of course, which is something we're going to talk about a lot in this film, how many Vietnamese, right, are exposed to this, war criminal behavior by the United States, right? Um, but it's interesting that that's where it starts, is with this recognition that his friend, who's the last member we find out later of his team, the last Green Beret, team member that he had, that he thought was still alive, who he's going to visit, is dead. It is also interesting that you have a black woman, black family in rural Washington state in the film. I mean, growing up in rural Oregon, look, that there it's not out totally outside of the realm of possibility. There were black people in the Pacific Northwest, but it would be pretty rare, right? It would be pretty rare that that they would be like living on a kind of like farm slash by the side of a lake. The mother's hanging up laundry as he finds her. It's kind of a strange place, an unusual place to find a black family.
It totally read odd to me, and I
Yeah.
do, my father's from Seattle, and but he grew up in like the city part of Seattle, and had a very city life. So it, not that I know anything specifically really outside of that. When I watched it was very odd, but it was this is where I'm talking about it kind of is aping new Hollywood aesthetics. And when you start the film, you're gonna think that it's like going to be this like coming home type movie. He's gonna go and see people. We're gonna see Stallone like crying in corners. Like it gives you the suggestion it's going to be this very morose, maybe even tender film, right? Like it really has like the music dripping and the heartstrings, very very melodrama, right? So when I'm watching it, I know what's happening, but I was trying to situate myself had I never seen it. I'm like, oh, this is going to be one of these like social dramas about someone who's struggling with coming back from Vietnam and losing his friends. But the film's also not that long. It's a 90-minute movie, which I did not remember. I found very interesting because right after that, they kick right into it. Right. The film does not take much time. It goes right into like the primary conflict, which is the character of Brian Dennehy. What's his name? William Teasel is his name, I believe, right?
Teasel.
Teasel,
Yep.
right? William Teasel, who was a sheriff in this town in Oregon, right? And
It's actually it's supposed to
Washington.
be
It's Washington.
Washington. So he's
Yeah.
coming south from someplace in Washington that they don't really name, where the mother of Delmar lives.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, I'm going to, he asks, Teasel asks him, where are you going? He says, Portland, right? But he doesn't know actually which direction Portland is. So then Teasel knows that like he's just talking. But anyways, yes, go ahead.
I have a question. Was Portland then considered like the hippie place like it is now?
So yeah, so this is a really interesting aspect of the film. A couple things. So one of the ways this film resonates with me is I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. So the landscapes, that's like where I grew up. And it has it's actually filmed in British Columbia, but it has a very Northwest feel. The Cascade Mountains are there. The scenery is really clearly of that region. Um, but Stallone's character being this drifter, right? That's the language that they use in the film. He's carrying with him a sleeping bag, as so it's like clear that this is a guy who's just like he's homeless, right? He's a homeless Vietnam veteran, and that was a very real thing and still is, of course, but like growing up in the Northwest, like the kind of hitchhiking, camping, like Vietnam veteran was a real phenomena. And part of it, of course, like we get into PTSD in this film, like this is a connection to like untreated mental illness that comes out of being in a war, etc. Right. Um, these are actual realities, and there was this connection I always felt growing up between like homelessness, a lot of veterans, and yeah, there is a kind of there definitely is a little bit of a hippie subculture. Like a lot of people moved, my parents being one of them, moved from the Bay Area up to places in Oregon, places in Washington, and kind of were a part of like a sort of back to the land kind of movement. You even had some communes crop up. You had people like converge around like hot springs and get into like hunting, fishing, farming, like these kinds of things. And it is it also connects, I think, to a kind of, unfortunately, like sort of settler mythology kind of retreat too, of like, this idea of the individual family or the individual person going out and being self-sufficient. But I think it's also a reflection of this period of like you have this kind of revolutionary upsurge and it doesn't achieve its goal. So then people try to figure out, okay, like what's the thing I'm gonna do next? Which I think we all kind of know that feeling of like you're losing. And so like you're like, okay, well, maybe we should just go start a commune in Oregon. Or maybe, I'm gonna go live off the land and be kind of pull myself out of this like terrible capitalist society in some way, etc. Um, and so Rambo actually, I think, does in this film fit certain characteristics of that. Like he's not working, etc. Right. And this is also a big source of the conflict. The other reason I bring this up is that Dennehy's character wants him out of the town. Like that, he wants him out. He's like, I'll drive you out. I'll try to be nice to you, quote unquote, but I'm gonna drive you out of the city limits until you kick rocks, like keep going. And this is like still something we see in terms of how cities try to respond to homelessness. And you really can kind of see some of these, like it didn't start in this period, but this kind of law enforcement like idea of what makes an upright citizen, a person who is like a contributor to society, like you have a job, you have a stable income, like you make something of yourself, you're disciplined in a certain way and self-disciplined in a certain way. And Stallone's character in this film like does not fit that narrative, and so it's a problem for Teasel, Dennehy's character.
Yeah, and from the novel, one of the things the author had said was, you know, I mean, in the novel, like I get he's actually even more hippied out. Like they kind of, I think they want Stallone's attractiveness to still kind of shine through, right, a little bit. So in the novel, he's supposed to be like really, like almost look like a bum completely, right? And they say it in the film, but to me, it's not as pronounced as Dennehy's uh uh like pronouncements that Stallone is some kind of bum, which then it makes it look like then he's like almost like even more overreacting. Like he's just a guy with like a coat and he's walking and he has a bag and it's like, dude, like you literally just see him as a vagrant. Like he could be anybody, right? But in the novel, they really actually upplay it.
He smells like
He
that's one of the
smells.
things that like Deni, he, clearly this guy has not showered, and
Right,
like
right,
that's
right.
another part of like what a human being does,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. You haven't bathed, my friend. But in the novel, what's interesting is what the guy said was, and I think this is actually an interesting point that kind of goes through the movie, but not in the same exact way, is this idea that, yes, he's a vagrant, but he's not really a vagrant. He's actually not really counterculture because he's been a soldier. He's actually of the state, right? And he's actually hiding out in a way. He is lying, or he is kind of falsifying, right? Which I think in the novel is then used to kind of make Rambo much more of a maybe devious character in that kind of way, or antagonistic character, right? It's like almost like two antagonists in the novel. While in the film, they clean him up a bit because you can tell very early in the movie emotionally who you're supposed to side with, right? They are very clear. This is not a two-hander film of like, oh, who do we think about, right? Who do we consider who's right or who's wrong? No, it is very clear that Rambo, by like centering him in everything, us knowing that he lost somebody early, right? We pretty much know he's in the military, even if you didn't know anything about the movie. That you're supposed to emotionally identify with him. So when Deni gets to him, I mean, and Deni, he's mean. Like, he does not have a nice moment ever. Even like his his drive, like his driving him is just vile. He's just talking to him like, "Look, we don't have that stuff here. You got to get up out of here." And like Rambo was like, "Man, look, like, why are you messing with me?" Right? And he's like, "Because that's you're not supposed to be here. Just get out of here." And then the big thing that Rambo does literally is he gets dropped off by Deni, by Teasel. Teasel drives away, and then Rambo decides to just walk back in that direction towards the town. And that is like literally what sets off the confrontation. Like, by that point, you're in full blown confrontation between the two. Not guns yet, but he gets arrested.
Yeah. So quickly, I mean, one thing in the novel, he has a big bushy beard too. Like you're supposed to be very clear that this person is like, a drifter is. Whereas like in the movie, yeah, you are kind of like, what are you like? Deni, he seems very over the top in how he's responding to him. Because Stallone also asked, "Can I get something to eat?" Right? Like, can you take me to a diner? Right? In the book, they do go eat together. In the novel, he's like, "No, like, there's a place 30 minutes up the road, like you can eat there." Sorry, in the book or in the movie, he says that, right? And yeah, so there's a lot of antagonism right up front. And this is also one of the things the author of the book doesn't like about the movie is that his book is supposed to set them up as you're not sure who the hero is. Is the hero Rambo or is the hero Teasel, right? And Teasel's a Korean War veteran, which you eventually find out in the film. Stallone is a Vietnam veteran, right? And so there's an interesting thing generationally that I'm sure we'll talk about more as this goes on, which is, I think, also based in certain realities that the film, I don't think deals with well. But that there was animosity from veterans of World War II, of veterans of the Korean War, of that generation who believed, look, we serve our country, like we do what we need when we're called upon, we go to these wars, and your generation didn't take that responsibility seriously enough. You shit on the American dream and da 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 da, right? Like this is kind of the thing. And I mean, I know a lot of that's anecdotal, but like this was true within aspects of my family. And I know many other people's families where this was the case. Like my father was a conscientious objector during Vietnam, so he refused to serve. And this was a big issue for his parents, who were still like somewhat on the left, but they had served in World War II. And it took him a long time to like explain to them, and I know this like but just sharing from my own family, like from his view that Vietnam is a very different war than World War II, right? Like we're not fighting the Nazis here. Like, we are actually going to another country and doing something quite evil, and so this was a kind of there is a generational aspect here what's interesting, and I hadn't thought about it that much, but as I've read this book, Spitting Image, is that I hadn't thought so much about that conflict between veterans, of people who actually serve, because my experience of it was my father refusing to serve, right, which is a different level of, a kind of refusal of his obligation as an American, right, in certain people's eyes. Whereas many people were drafted and they went. They didn't necessarily want to, or they didn't have a good, feeling about it. And how was that generational conflict around that? So that's a very interesting thing historically. And I think the book is trying to deal with that through kind of bad politics. I think this film is doesn't really deal with it, but that's supposed to be kind of where you get some of this conflict between Teasel and Rambo, and it's not quite named in the film at any point like that. That's never voiced, interestingly.
Yeah, and y- you might be or might not be surprised. I mean, when you do a kind of backtrack of the 80s, I mean, this is one of the major themes. I mean, I think of that Wonder Years scene where Karen brings home the boyfriend, right? And he basically says he's gonna, draft dodge, and and then but what Kevin and Karen's father was in Korea. And he has like the big like yelling moment and all about it. But what I always found interesting as I've gotten more politically minded is one of the things that this era, and we'll talk about it with Rambo towards the end of the film, and really, really throughout, is it's always been centered around now the soldiers and never around the Vietnamese, right? Or if it's around the Vietnamese, it's around how it's morally destroying American society, right? Not that it's an imperialist project and you're just denying national sovereignty of Vietnamese people, so forth and so on, right? No, it's about we've lost our souls, right? And Rambo does a version of it in a different kind of way, but in throughout the 80s, it is the like prevailing vision of how we're supposed to look at Vietnam as like this moral quandary for the American people, that we morally lost ourselves by sending our people over there, not that we went over there in the first place, right? Or that we even had the idea to deny national sovereignty to these people in Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to this as it goes on, but absolutely right. It's
Yeah.
a big problem of like the displacement of the real issues in these films and what that's doing. One moment where the veteran thing does kind of come through, I forgot this, is Teasel, so Teasel comes out. This is like a very beginning in the film when you're first introduced to him. He's like saying good morning to people. It's a small town. There were like 3,000 people in Hope, British Columbia, which is where it's filmed, not Hope, Washington, because that's fictional. Um, and he's saying hellos and all that, and then he runs into Rambo and he says, wearing that jacket, looking the way you do, you're asking for trouble around here, friend. And so this is the way that they kind of deal with the veteran thing slightly. The only real time I think it's kind of referenced like this in the film. But as we've shown, he has in the film this green jacket, which sort of symbolizes soldiers, etc. It has an American flag on it, but it's that he doesn't look the part. He looks like a hippie to Teasel. He's like, you look like a hippie. You have long hair. His hair's not like crazy long, but this is the implication, right? If your hair's not as short as mine is right now, if you don't have some kind of crew cut, then you're not a real man, right? And this is kind of something that is supposed to be symbolic, and was for the time. There was a big thing about cutting hippies' hair and like all this stuff. In I think, yeah, I think I even have some like weird family stories of like people like getting a cousin or a brother and like they tie him down, they cut his hair, right? Like it's a very, and that actually is something that happens in the book. Is they force Rambo to they cut his hair. In the book or in the movie, they just do it by the shaving scene, which we'll get to in a minute. But this idea that we got to clean him up means they need to be like clean cut, and all of this, and that this again is tied to your upright bourgeois American manhood, and that you're disrespecting the flag that you're wearing on your chest by how you look right now, son.
Yeah, I mean, and it reflects definitely also, I think, the kind of you're thinking about the movie, because this kind of attitude is clearly shown by Deni being so over the top in the film, as like a bad attitude. So it also shows like the power change that happened, right? Like the people who probably, because you probably think a lot of these filmmakers were not probably not for Vietnam, right? And now they're in, they're now in Hollywood. So they're able to kind of tell their side. Now they're not anti-imperialists and they're not anti-capitalists and probably by this point, you beginning to see the purging of like real lefty communist filmmakers. By like the 90s, they're all gone, really. Like you don't have that in the US, but you're kind of get to see a slight revenge maybe of a certain generation of thought, but one that's still with happy to be within the kind of US system. So the next kind of part of the film, which is like where the film like really kicks into like a whole other gear, is when he then goes and he gets arrested and they take him into the police station. And the cops, young David Caruso is in it, which I totally forgot. Like David Caruso is one of the cops in it, and he's the cop who's always kind of like, why are we doing this a little bit? He's into like being an asshole, but he's also kind of like and then when he finds out that Rambo is an actual badass, he like loses his shit. But I digress. But you get these, this system of like putting him, through the fingerprinting, which he like really resists. And you have this other police officer, which I forget his name and who plays him, who is like while like Brian Dennehy, while Teasel is like aggressive, there is a kind of order to his aggressiveness. Like he still wants to go through the procedures, right? Like, but he wants Rambo locked up, I mean, for vagrancy also. We have to remember this is for vagrants. Vagrancy and resisting arrest is his charge, right? He wants him locked up. There is this other police officer who's like next level. He is like the super bad cop. He wants to, destroy Rambo. So he's like hitting him, being aggressive with him,
It's
I mean, event,
the character's name is Art Galt, is the
Art
name
Galt,
of him, and he's like supposed to be an old friend of Teasel's, but
right?
he's more fascistic.
Yeah, he has that's perfect, a more fascistic character to him, right? And what they begin to do in the movie is do these quick little interspersed cuts of Rambo back in Vietnam being tortured by the Vietnamese, right? And a couple things to point out with that. It is the only visual representation of Vietnamese people in the entire film. Are these interspersed moments of him of Rambo being tortured, right? So it'll be like he's like being tied up and whipped and all these various things, and it really like intense sounds, right? And it's to set up that he has PTSD, but it does also a couple of other things psychologically. How it situates the idea of how the American experience was there. This idea that they were in this hell, right? And the people who are the demons of the hell were the Vietnamese, right? Like they're like a demon people, right? Because if you don't give that much information, that's exactly what it's saying. But it's also, I have to, and I said this to Jay, like, this is not a new stereotype, right? A movie like The Manchurian Candidate, I don't know if people have seen this film. The idea of Asian torture and of communist torture and like having special torture skills is something that's been played in Hollywood quite a lot, right? Manchurian Candidate is one of the films, right, where you have this soldier get intercepted and the mind control and all these types of things, right? Americans see something American happening American in America. What are we, a bunch of Asians? Exactly. That's exactly the point, right? This like obsession, right, with like they have extra levels of torture. And I will say that did affect me when I was in, I thought that like communists when I was like a kid like had like torture chambers. Watching movies like this, and even if I wasn't, early, like super pro America, I definitely thought, what they were doing over there was wild, right? Because of these movies. And but another element is interesting, borrowed from the book, is the
I,
author. Go ahead. You want to say something?
I just want to say something about that
Yeah.
is like, so there's all these stories of POWs, and like there's the so-called Hanoi Hilton, right? Which and one of the things is just important to contextualize about this as well is that the so-called Hanoi Hilton was a French prison under French colonialism that tortured and executed communists, nationalists, dissidents within Vietnam, right? And so in 1954, after the Battle of Dien Phu, when Ho Chi Minh and everybody lead this like amazing, one of the most amazing revolutionary kind of guerrilla upsurges to expel a colonizer in history, they take over this place, and initially it's used as a re-education center, and then eventually during the war, not until like 1964 do they start using it for to house POWs in the of the US. But it is this thing that's really important to say, which is like, if we want to talk about the scale of war crimes that were happening, like the United States killed 2 million people. They were firing defoliants through the forest. There's the My Lai massacre. There's all of this stuff that actually very much contributed to the anti-war sentiment as well, right? And so even in the United States, there was a widespread recognition that not only was this like just not a good war, etc., but that it was incredibly, you know, dehumanizing, fascistic, genocidal, right? To talk also about what's going on right now in Gaza, right? And so people see that and they respond to it. And so it is something quite sinister to then take our representation, and the only thing that we get out of the war from an image standpoint is images of Rambo being tortured. And then even when, like, part of the thing I like about this film is that Rambo resists and goes on the offensive against police state violence, and and so like that part is like, oh, like you don't get this very often. We don't usually get the good guy like turning on the cops and taking them on and kicking their butt, you know, and all of this. But the location of the police's fascism that we get in the film is like it's like a metaphor for the fascism of the Vietnamese, rather
Exactly.
than like white supremacy, settler colonialism, slavery, like. And so it's a real like psychological displacement that's going on that is very sinister in the film.
And that's exactly it. Like the Vietnamese get to define carceral systems. Like that's who they are, right? Which is like we all know America and liberalism literally built it. John Locke and these people, they built these ideas. But no, in this film, the definition of torture, of imprisonment, right, of these kinds of things is defined by Vietnamese, by communists. They are the definition, which goes into like the authoritarian mythologies and totalitarian mythologies that kind of go around. Like these cultures are anti-liberal. It just, these really quick images. And I want to read one quick thing that the guy said when he wrote the book, which I think is informative. He said, "What if I wrote a book in which the Vietnam War literally came home to America?" And I find that to be really informative because the film, I think, still tries to do this as well, that it's Vietnam that's come home, right? America typically is a pretty chill place. It's beautiful, right? There's not issues here in America, right? So Vietnam has now come home, and now we have civil unrest, which is, you, I don't have to tell you how ridiculous that is as a thought.
Yeah. Well, and also like, I mean, one of the issues too is the displacement of like, so part of when he comes up with that idea is like images of the Vietnam War on his screen. This is the author of David Morrell talking. And he's like, and then I'm also watching, I can't remember what he says, like Los Angeles Burn or something like that. Like, and I'm thinking about this. And I think, what if we embody that through a person, and he comes up with Rambo, and it's like, no, but that thing that you're talking about is actually the thing. Like actual civil unrest as opposed to US empire and opposed to also the racial capitalist policies that are, happening in black neighborhoods and other, oppressed nations within the imperial core and so on. Like that's the contradiction that's actually interesting. And there were people who were like, let's bring the war home, right? Like there were the Weather Underground, there was the BLA,
Good
there's all
point.
of this. And, we'll get to this later, I think, as we talk about, I want to talk a little bit about representations of veterans and so on. But the, it's again, it's like you creating this character, and Rambo's supposed to somehow stand in for like the what Vietnamese did to him, I guess, but also then what Vietnamese guerrilla war is like. So it's like kind of a way of making that seem like this really horrific and torturous kind of thing. And so there's a lot of things that it does, but again, like these kind of displacements and reframing the way that we might think about these things. It's really, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So Rambo, after like several of these images, and like they really do the match cuts like pretty heavily, right? Like, he's in a chokehold. They mirror the chokehold. So he eventually it becomes too much, especially at the moment of the shave. It was the shaving, right? It's the shaving it becomes the moment where they liken the shaving to, I forget exactly
Him
what the image
him
is.
him being sliced with a
Yes.
sword across
Hmm.
the chest
Yes.
by like a Vietnamese like commandant or something like that.
Yeah.
One other thing just quickly that we forgot to mention earlier is the knife. So that's the one weapon that they take off of him, and it's this big Bowie knife. And he gets it back, but this becomes the kind of an iconic image of Rambo 2 alongside like Crocodile Dundee having this big knife. This is also like a very 80s and early
Yeah.
90s thing that kids want and all that stuff. But yeah.
Let's button that, because I actually want to come back to that, because that to me, and bringing the Crocodile Dundee thing, I think is important, because it when you get to Troutman speaking about Rambo, it gets very interesting about his characteristics, right? So yeah, they liken like the strangling to like him being, or the
They
possible
put him in a
shaving,
chokehold with a
right?
nightstick. Yep, and
So he breaks
that's like
out.
being it's like basic he's also in that image like almost crucified. Like
Yeah,
he's
it's
up, he's
total
all
Christ
stretched
figure.
out and yeah.
Is total Christ figure, right? I mean, no, actually, let's even go further. The first time we see his shirt off, what do you see? Whip marks. So they're totally Christ figuring him. And like the shot, it's like like I said, a lot of long wide shots. There's a long shot of him and three of the cops looking at his body, all kind of whipped up, right, and tons of scars on it. He's totally Christ figured, right? Totally, he is the living example of torture, of sacrifice, so forth and so on, right? And he can't be honored. It's totally a Christ thing. So he breaks out, and the movie goes from like, tender melodrama, sad, to like this kind of antagonistic misunderstanding to like full on action, right? And he whips these cops butt, right? Like he just kicks them. He's able to break out. Like, I mean, the only energy he's expounding is because there's so many, not because they're actually that difficult, each one of them, for him to take out. And he just busts, out of this jail, which, also mirrors, his POW experience, right? He was a prisoner of war, and he had to, liberate himself from this, evil supervillains, right? That existed in Vietnam. You have something to say, Jay?
Just notes, yeah, he beats the crap out of at least 7 police in this scene to get himself out of it. He launches 2 of them through glass windows, and then as he gets out, he steals a dirt bike too, right? Which then leads to the first kind of chase scene.
Right. And they really, like I said, staying with the wide shots. He's moving through. You got center mass Stallone on the motorcycle, and then he's like chasing him in the cop car. And they also make a point in the movie that like Stallone, whenever he drives, it's like super focused and like it moves, and like the cop cars are always kind of wavering, right? Like it's hilarious. Like they're like half Keystone cops, half like super overzealous, which is like kind of, I guess, one and the same, which is also a theme that you're going to see a lot in the 80s. This denigration of local police in a lot of movies that exists,
Yeah.
right? Or conflicts between different systems of authority. So like FBI don't like police. You even have it in this movie with like the state police and the local police don't get along. Also, just military. We'll get to Troutman in a moment. Troutman has a real antagonistic relationship with Teasel, right? And of course, Rambo being of military, even though Deni he doesn't know at the beginning, showing that kind of difference. And it's a huge theme in the 80s. When we do Die Hard, none show this better than Die Hard, the kind of like hate of all the different systems of each other. But in this film, like they definitely are big into like the cops just being totally reckless, like they have no sense of order, right? In a way, Deni he's the most together one, and he's an asshole.
And I don't think that this is wrong either. Like, I think that there's a more realistic portrayal of police in the 70s and 80s as like this kind of bumbling group of like fascistic like weirdos that are all like kind of working out their own patriarchal BS with each other. And there's some conflicts within them. I mean, I do think the kind of conflict between agency stuff is a little bit overplayed. I do think there's some reality to that. I also think though, like in a post 9/11 world, you kind of got more of a kind of synergy between a lot of these systems that maybe didn't exist as much earlier. But yeah. I mean, I think that there are these different conflicts, but I actually think that there's something to, and I think it's one of the things I think that I like about the film also is that the police are not shown as like this amazing group of people that can figure anything out and solve any problem, always get their guy, always get to the bottom of it, da 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 da. They're like driven by this kind of fascistic drive. I mean, this is a person who was arrested for vagrancy, right? Which literally, by their definition, it's like because he doesn't have a job, like because he can't produce that he has a job, he's a vagrant. And like so it's really like a story on some level of a homeless person like taking on an entire like first local, state, then national kind of military and overcoming. So there is a certain aspect of, and I think this is something Stallone gets, is like the underdog stories like resonate, right? And so this is like part of his thing, and so anyways, I think that he gets something there about our like psychology.
That's a good point. And also like the underdog who really shouldn't be, right? Like he actually has like the gift, right? And that's something you notice. It's not like when he's fighting them, even before you hear Troutman talk about how skilled he is, immediately like how he takes out the police, like that he's at a higher level, right? And then he gets the bike, he like gets into the woods, right? And he's able to navigate a dirt bike going up a mountain. And then Teasel can't get his car to even drive, and it literally falls off of the side of like a cliff, like not to his death, but like just falls off and he can't get it. So it's like he doesn't have a refinement, Teasel and these cops, while Rambo, you can immediately tell, oh, well, he's cut above, right? You get this idea that he's at least trained, right? And trained at a high level. Now, they're going to step it up in the narrative of him even being a super soldier, essentially being like the one, which becomes a narrative that is, really focused in the 80s, this idea of the superhuman level soldier, which we have now all identified, Rambo to be through, toys and all this type of stuff. But yeah, like there's a line once he gets into the woods with all of them where, and I believe it is David Caruso, he says, he's hunting us.
Yeah. We should, like, a plot
Yeah.
point we do need to hit home is like, so they do sort of corner him initially. He's on the edge of this huge cliff that's like a straight drop. And so Rambo starts to try to like scale down the side of this, just like, he's like doing like insane rock climbing without any equipment or whatever, but he can't go too far because basically there's just nowhere to go ultimately. And they call Art Galt, who again is like the most fascistic cop. He has to go commandeer a helicopter from the local timber company. Which is also very funny and very realistic for like a small town police
And
force
also
in the
it's
80s.
very clear the guy doesn't want to do it. And
Yeah.
Deni, he basically says like, look, I'll snatch him up.
Yeah.
I'll
He
snatch
says
him up.
if you don't do it, I'm going to put him on charges for obstruction is what he says. And so he gets the helicopter, he comes out, and Teasel's like trying to radio him because he knows Art's a little bit on the crazy side, and he's like trying to like make sure because he starts to hear shots firing out. So Art gets Stallone in his shots in his he's hanging out the side of a helicopter with like a deer rifle, and he's trying to shoot Stallone on the side of this cliff, and he's firing shots. Like he's pissed off. He's one of the first cops that gets beaten up and gets beat up pretty good by Stallone. Stallone like gouges at his eye and all this kind of stuff. And so he's shooting, and so then Teasel's like radioing him, like, "Hey, what's going on? What's going on?" etc. Like, doesn't probably want they want to capture this guy. I think at this point is probably Teasel's position at the moment. So Rambo, this is a crazy scene, but he jumps off the side of the cliff, which is like probably a 300-foot fall or something like that. And he comes down in the branches of this large, either redwood or cedar tree that's just massive. He cuts himself all up on the branches of this tree, has these like huge gashes and stuff like that. But it slows his fall enough that like he's able to get to the ground. And then Teasel's like bringing the helicopter around. The pilot, he's like, hold steady so I can shoot him, all this stuff. The pilot's like, I can't, I can't hold this thing steady. And he's like, you hold it steady or I'm going to kill you, he says to the pilot. And Rambo then picks up a rock, chucks it, hits the helicopter's windshield, causes the pilot to shake, and Art Galt falls to his death, which is how also Rambo gets his first gun, as he takes Art Galt's, deer rifle, essentially, which is what he has in the beginning. And like, this is also a central plot point because he Teasel and all them come out. Stallone's character Rambo comes out. Rocky, whatever. Rambo comes out, and he's like, I didn't do it. He puts his hands up to them and all of this. He's like, he fell, like it wasn't me, and and they're like not taking. They're like, you have to surrender. He's like, surrender for what? Like, you arrested me for nothing. Like, just let's let it go. Like, somebody's already dead. I don't want more people to die. And so this is also kind of a theme in the movie too, is like Rambo is actually trying to like walk away from this at multiple points, and they're the ones who keep escalating the conflict. And he's like, look, if you're going to come after me, like, I'm going to make your life hell, basically. But they then, I think a couple of the cops shoot at him from the cliff as he's like has his hands up, and then he just runs off, and it's really on at that point. Like, that's then he goes and gets stuff and he starts to do his whole guerrilla thing. But I just think that scene's important too, because they want to, I think I don't know if they know how Art Galt died. I mean, because I mean, eventually they probably would have heard from the helicopter guy, but this is not really dealt with in the film. Um, and so they blame Rambo for killing Galt, essentially treating him as a cop killer. But I think they kind of know too, but anyways, that's part of it, is like, do they know? But they treat him as a cop killer, and he's like, look, you've
Well,
arrested me
Teasel
for
doesn't
nothing.
care. I mean, Teasel's main
Yeah.
thing is my friend is dead and this guy has escalated and he didn't do what I asked him to do. But Caruso's character, and I think at least one of the other cops, because it's around that moment you find out that A, he's a soldier, B, a Vietnam veteran, and then C, a Green Beret. Right, and there's a shot of Caruso that I really love. It's like a low angle shot, and you just see him. He's a Green Beret. These guys are badasses. Like the whole subtext is, can we just go home? Right? He's like, I don't want to do this, man. He's like, this was not how I wanted to start my day. Right? Like now I'm in the woods chasing a Green Beret who just literally killed somebody. I don't want to make this happen. Right? And like. But also they begin to set up that Rambo is extraordinary. And I did a little research on Green Berets, like in narratives, and Green Berets as like characters were really big in 60s pulp novels. They would, situate ex-Green Berets as coming into, like I said, coming into communities and like, fighting crime, or, super cops, right? Or even Green Beret like novels about them going to other places and, doing imperial acts that America had to do, but, making it not an imperial act, but we know it to be that. So like the whole kind of narrative of the Green Beret gets infused in there, and it's really, really, I think, useful for what they're going to do later in the movie.
Yeah, there's this whole connection too that you start to see at this point. So he sews up the gash with he has a needle and thread inside of his Bowie knife. He's able to unscrew it and get it out. And this is something that, we see in the next scene too, as he starts to set all the booby traps and stuff like that. That this film deeply connects to this kind of survivalist. I think it's like incipient to this kind of survivalist militia subculture that really takes off big time in the 90s, but it's really starting to get some of this in the 80s. And I think that's a big thing here too, is that Rambo is this character that kind of does like multiple things, and that's one of them. Is he's just like and that's connected to the Green Beret point, because it's like this belief that if you're an Army Ranger or a Green Beret or a Navy SEAL within our society, that these people just can do anything. Like they are trained to do anything.
And what they always do with it is that they're like the master of like all cultures, right? And you see this in like martial arts movies. Think about a movie like Bloodsport. Maybe we should do Bloodsport. A movie like Bloodsport, right? The fact that you have this Western man who's able to, beat he doesn't just win a tournament amongst Chinese people in Hong Kong. He beats the entire world doing it, right? Right. But also the fact that he's a military person in the film, right? That the high level military specialist, he can appropriate the things that we think are really high level skilled about Asian people or communists or African or whatever. He can take those things, be close to the land, which what normal Westerners can do. But he has Western logic, Western training. So the greatest soldier will be this European who is able to kind of appropriate the skills, which they said, they would admit that the Vietnamese soldiers were very good at, being close to the land and hiding, all the kind of, which I also think, I mean, in truth, you can make racism, right? Because like, yeah, if they were able to like defeat the U.S. in the way that they did, I'm sure they were great soldiers. But then they also would take their greatness and make it into like how they're like demon people who come out the grass and the water,
Yeah.
like the way they make them they make them seem. But Rambo has that ability too. But he has Western training, so he's like superhuman. He is like the
Yeah.
next level.
And this is one of the most, I think, dangerous, nefarious things that's going on with this film and the subsequent ones, and a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about in the 80s, is like there was this crisis in terms of people even wanting to serve in the US military. And there's also, and part of it is connected to this perception of Vietnam and of it, and like not just perception, but it's connected to what the Vietnam War was, how people felt about it, how people who served felt about it. One of the things we'll get into is like how many vets were actually in the anti-war movement, and all of this. And which again might be why Dennehy, they don't deal with that, but it might be why Dennehy, picks him up for looking the way he does, wearing that jacket. And what you do is you replace it with this propaganda piece of this like super duper competent super soldier kind of figure. And kids, this is one of the really sinister things about the 80s is the way that these images are marketed to children very intentionally. We'll get to GI Joe, I'm sure, as we go through the 80s. And Rambo also had action figures, and it had a cartoon series that we'll talk about at some point too. This is
Mm-hmm.
later on, but this is like the groundwork of it. And it's saying like, okay, maybe we can't promote the wars very well, but we have to make people want to be this guy. We have to make people want to be, and the only way you can be it, be all you can be. The only way you can be it is by joining the army or the Marines or the Navy. Like you have to be in the military to become this kind of badass. Even the cops are not this kind of badass. You need that army, you need that Green Beret school, you need all of that stuff, right? And this is like the really sinister imperialist propaganda, one of the most sinister aspects of imperialist propaganda in the 80s, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just even going anecdotally, I remember when I became a teenager, like friends of mine who had a certain, attraction to being tough or even if they weren't tough, if they were bullied. I knew one dude bullied all the time, right? The first thing that he kind of got recognition for was he could freestyle. He was a dope rapper, right? But he went to the military at 18. He said he wanted to be a Navy SEAL. I don't think it ever happened, but like that was his dream, right? To be a SEAL because and I knew it had to do with his masculinity, right? He wanted to be seen as this way of like going like high level, right? And the only way to do that is to go into the military and like develop these Rambo like skills. So speaking of Rambo like skills, so by this point, like Rambo, you see him like, get like, go into like the camouflage and he's setting up everything. You don't really see like the beginnings of like how he sets up like these like all these traps for them. You see a little bit of it, but they do a little bit of like absence of information to kind of like catch you off guard when it happens. So the cops and also like the cops along with like two like random dudes who are in the bushes with dogs, they like join up, right, to kind of like hunt Rambo. And one by one, via booby traps, capturing them, a quick hit and run. Even one he does where he intercepts. He has a guy set up to shoot him, and he moves out the way, and he ends up shooting another cop. He takes them all out, right? And it's
That
slick.
was That was an
Huh?
insane scene, by the way.
Yeah,
Like,
it
because
is
he's
insane
like, he
scene.
dodges a bullet. Like, this is
Yes.
like I was sitting there watching. I'm like, this is like, or before Matrix. Like this, like
Yeah.
stand there, like, whoop,
No, like
But yeah,
I mean he's super level, right? He's like the highest level, right? And like he's on a whole other tip, right? And he like takes them all out. Now, one of the things, and when we say take them all out, he doesn't kill them all. He wounds them. So you're getting this, idea that like, okay, wait a minute, is he gonna like kill him? What's happening? And then he finally gets to Teasel, right? He finally gets Teasel where he has the knife to Teasel's neck. And he's like, look, I could kill you, but I'm not. Like, let's stop this, right? So you're showing that, this guy with this kind of extraordinary training has more restraint, right? He actually has restraint. So it does a couple of things. I mean, one thing it does, it shows that, he's clearly on a whole other level than these cops, but also that he is the more human one, right? And that he has a humanistic kind of element to him, which is really manipulative when you get to the end of the film, right? Because he's able to have humanity for the police who are chasing him, the his friend who dies. We'll talk about that in the end. But there's a group, the Vietnamese, that he doesn't seem to have that ability to have a kind of humanistic, empathy for, if for lack of a better word, right?
100%. So yeah, so there's that scene, there's all the booby traps, which
Yeah,
I was reading online, they're called like bushcraft, or bushcraft booby traps or something like that. And this is a whole like he basically crafts like essentially like a man-made like kind of bear trap out of like sharpened sticks, and like it gets stuck in the gut. Like there's all these kind of scenes, again, very connected to the kind of survivalist, because they're also sort of the types of traps that you could use to hunt animals and things like this. Um, at this point, though, so he goes, he has the confrontation with Teasel. He's like, I could kill you, but I'm not going to. But don't push it, or I'll give you a war.
yeah.
Let it go, let it go. So then the next scene is they flip to this field hospital basically that's been set up to like deal with
Right.
all of the wounded cops.
You have the
And
press, the media, like they're there,
now,
the state police.
yeah, and then this is where you first get introduced to Colonel Samuel Troutman, who is a central figure in all the Rambo films, at least the first three. I don't They made more recent ones in
Oh,
like the 2000s. I don't know if I
Richard
can't remember
Crenna's
if he shows up there.
he's probably dead by that point, I
Yeah,
think. Yeah.
yeah. um but he then comes in to contextualize for Teasel, like, who is this person that they've been going after. They do know now that he's a Green Beret, and that they know he had the Congressional Medal of Honor, right? Which Teasel also is like, I can't remember his commendate, like his medal, but he had a medal from Korea, like, so he thinks he's a badass too. But Rambo has the highest recognition from the state, right? And so Troutman says, well, Teasel says to Troutman, whatever possessed God in heaven to make a man like Rambo. And Troutman says, God didn't make Rambo, I did. And he goes on this speech about how, like, he'll eat, he can do all these things. He's an expert in guerrilla warfare. He can
I
live
have the
off the
line right
land.
here. You have to read the line. You don't
Go ahead.
seem to want to accept the fact that you're dealing with an expert in guerrilla warfare, with a man who's the best with guns, with knives, with his bare hands. And I have to say, the way Richard Crenna comes in the movie, he's so over the top. His performance is like, it's like everyone's kind of acting on a certain level. It's like a naturalism, but like a little bit of an uptick. Like it's almost like Troutman's in a whole other movie, which kind of works a little bit too, because like he is coming from like the military world, but like the performance is so over the top. The way he speaks, you're like, whoa, who is this guy?
He's already in Rambo 2. Yeah, he's already in the
He's
second one.
already in Rambo 2, right? But no, but that's also a good point, because Troutman's a funny character, I think, in the film, because what they do with Troutman is, to me, really pernicious. It's they use him as a way to say, yes, it's morally on a gray line to train someone like Rambo to have an uptick of violence. We'll talk about his scene with Teasel. They have another one-on-one scene at a bar that's really, really informative. Yes, it's in a moral gray area, but these things are necessary in our Manichaean world, right? Which, like, I know you study like the counterinsurgency literature. I thought Troutman as like one of those characters. I was like, oh, Troutman is one of those people. He's, how do we take out people who want to stop the imperialist project? I know it's a morally gray area what we're going to do here, and we might have, some collateral damage, but it's a must happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's prefiguring what comes later, and we'll talk about it when it comes to. But this, like, Rambo is also kind of in that he's like, look, I'm the guy who can do whatever you want to do. Just don't get in my way. Like, just don't mess with me if you're like, if you're a civilian or whatever, like, but nobody get in the way of me completing my mission because I know how to do it. And he said the other line that Troutman says in the scene is that he said he can eat things that would make a billy goat puke. And I just thought like, like that's the craziest. Like that's actually a good line.
No, I
um,
honestly, if you don't rewatch the movie, you don't like, I don't want to rewatch this. Just watch that scene for laughter. Like, find the Troutman scene. It is so over the top. Like, it's too, I'm sure someone's clipped it on YouTube. It is absolutely over the top, right? But, I also remember when I was young, going back to your point, people thinking Troutman was really cool because he's also a father figure, right? And he's like the definitive father figure, right? Where if you think about the generations thing, Teasel is who should be a father figure to Rambo because he was in a previous war. Troutman is the actual. So it's like, because if you look at Teasel and Troutman, they actually have conversations. They're very antagonistic and they have a lot of blow up, but he does open up to him. And we'll talk about that bar scene. I think that bar scene is huge to me about the ideology around a lot of this stuff. But there is a way that they're kind of used as like the tale of two like fatherly paths. Teasel and Troutman, and Teasel's is a very antagonistic one. I have to kind of whip you into shape, and Troutman's is a whip you into shape in a different kind of way. Tough love, a tough love kind of father.
There's elements with Troutman though, I think also of something kind of sinister and real, like so there is this sort of like there's conversations, we'll get to them later, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but the point being that like Troutman also engages in sort of psychological warfare, I would say, right, with Teasel to some extent, but definitely with Rambo, right? And so there is this kind of like, I created you, like I know how to program you, I know what buttons to push thing. And it is very much a kind of uh like head of I don't know if anybody's seen, this is a terrible reference, but Scandal, there's like Papa Pope in Scandal who is like Olivia's father, but he heads this like dark, I forget what they're called, BX13 or something like that, and like it's like supposed to be like like deeper than the CIA. It's like a level, like a deeper state below that. And Troutman's kind of that kind of figure where it's like he just shows up, like, how does he know to know where to, like all these kind
Within
of things.
hours, like within
Yeah.
hours, he's there. Like this has been going on what, half a day, and Troutman's already there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty hilarious. Like, Rambo's, it almost suggests that he's been tracking Rambo this whole time. Like, they keep an active track on him. So so they just know what he's doing, and then he just kind of jumps in. But it's interesting. This made me think about a kind of like narrative around fathers who build their children and have to aggressively build special children. Like, I was an NFL fan when I was young, like the whole Todd Marinovich thing. Remember him? He was like that, like the robot quarterback, and his dad, like, like made him the number one pick, but Marinovich ended up being a bust, and it ended up falling apart. And I've seen a doc on it.
As a Raiders fan growing up, you're bringing up a lot of really painful memories, right?
Yeah, exactly. But Marinovich was, and it was that narrative, right? Like he was going to make his son into the best thing. I mean, even some like the mythologies around Tiger Woods' dad, right? How he made Tiger into a thing, right? And Troutman, he's reminiscent of that kind of vibe, right? Like Rambo has a special innate quality. God could not make him. I can. So I have a duty to kind of actualize him. Now, also, what I'm actualizing to be might be kind of rabid, but the world needs this. The world order needs this. And Troutman in the film is interesting because, and the way Krenna is told to play it, I'm sure, or he decides to play it, is while he might have nerves that Rambo is going to die, or they're not going to, be able to kind of figure this out, or like something else is going to blow up. He does not regret making Rambo who he is, right? He's very resolute, and it's really insidious, right? It's like you as an audience are supposed to identify that these things are necessary, like the creation of these kinds of people at this kind of rough measure is a necessary thing for society. I mean, like, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, somebody brought up, so yeah, Todd Marinovich reference that's so millennial coded, wondering what the whole experience of Gen Z has been. One analog we might say that younger folks might get is like um LeVar Ball and the Ball children, right? Like, and how also as they've gotten a little bit older, like some of them have kind of broken ranks with their father or whatever, but like this idea of this dad, or even like
The
Serena
Williams
Williams.
sisters, yeah,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Williams sisters is another one, right? Like the Richard Williams thing, like that
Yeah,
totally is one. I mean,
yeah.
or a lot of I mean, it was a big thing with tennis players for a long time. Jennifer Capriati, right? Jennifer Capriati, these types of people, like the big narrative, especially of individualistic or because quarterback, even though you're a quarterback in a team thing, the quarterback is an individual, right? You're great because of yourself, no one else, right? The offensive line and the receivers don't matter. The quarterback makes everything happen, right? So it is that kind of mentality that exists, right? So yeah, so keep going with the movie. Rambo, he's now hiding out. The Troutman is trying to convince them to really let him go. He says, like, let him go, and then we'll pick him up somewhere in Seattle. I think he even says Seattle or something like that, or
He says
Teasel says
Seattle.
it. He says Seattle,
Yeah.
right? We'll pick him up and we'll figure it out. But for Teasel, that's like a no can do, right? Because Teasel then later reveals that he really wants to get this kid, right? He says it, I want to get this kid,
I
right?
think there's also too, like in this scene, it comes out that Mitch, who's Caruso's character, has now revealed, I think, to the state police and some other people that they were doing some fascist shit in that
Yes.
local police office. And so there's also like an interesting thing where I think Teasel is partly driven by a need to clean up his own mess so that it doesn't get bigger than him, so that he doesn't jeopardize his own department or it's a sheriff's office, and his like deputies and so on, because he knows that they have definitely overstepped the line in how they've gone after Rambo as well. And I think that's part of the conflict too.
Because in the room when he states it is with the state police officer, and the state police officer looks at him like, what are y'all doing? Like, what's up with y'all down there? Which is like another this thing of like the different levels of authority having
Yeah, which is
disagreements with each other.
total BS. I mean,
I
the
know.
idea that Teasel has to defend the way that his sheriff's office operates to the state police, and that the state police officer is going to come in and be like, "Oh, you're violating civil rights." Like, come on, like, absurd scene.
Yeah. Another thing that exists is, but they also like there's a way that Dennehy Teasel doesn't really like upward intervention. Like, he resents Troutman. He says he doesn't trust him. He has this like negativity towards authorities coming in. I mean, he says that, I don't trust you, Troutman. I think you're just here trying to cover up your own mess, which is kind of ironic because clearly Teasel's trying to cover up his own mess. So it's like, pot calling the kettle black. And this is when you begin to kind of get Troutman, beginning to start admitting certain things. So, well, before we get to that, I mean, the other big scene that then happens is they bring out, are they local, like National Guard? Is that what they are?
I think they're reservists. Like, I was trying to figure
Reservists.
this out,
Yeah,
but
it
they
wasn't
are
super clear.
they sort of reference it as National Guard, but the guys, like, especially as they get into the woods, they're like, I only do this job on the weekends, kind of thing, or like, I didn't sign up to get killed, kind of shit. So I think that's what they're supposed to be implied, is like maybe reservists for the Army National Guard or something along those lines.
So it's hilarious. Like, they get into this like frontal confrontation with Rambo, right? and like it's like I'll say like a dozen of them, right? And they have all the guns, right? And like they're like quarter Rambo, right? And like he shoots back at them, and they all like duck behind a tree, like they want none of this smoke, literally. Like literally, like they're like, oh no, 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 we want none of this. This dude has skills, right? Yes, there's 12 of us who all have guns with more ammo than he does, but this dude just like almost took out every single one of us in one shot. I don't want to
Yeah.
deal with this.
So he has, and it was funny I was talking to you about this. I couldn't figure out where he got the M16 because it just sort of like out of nowhere seems like, oh, how now he has an assault rifle, whereas he had like a deer rifle with a couple rounds in the first part, and most of the action in the first scene against these guys in the woods is all like handmade traps and stuff like this. In this scene, he has an M16, which I guess he took off of a police officer in the initial raid, is the implication. But then he's now found this mine shaft, right? So that's the other part, is he's in this like this cave sort of mine shaft there. And yeah, he sprays out with the M16 and takes out like, like almost decapitates like a whole line of them. But yeah, there's like 100 of them all with M16s, and they're all terrified of him.
So they whip out a bazooka. Like it's not like let's reform and like do a different kind of positioning thing and there's more of us than him. No, it's like this guy has too much skill. Where's the bazooka, right? And they literally shoot a bazooka at Rambo, and it's just wild. Like I was just like, oh wow, this movie is just really a lot, right? A lot over the top, right? Shooting a bazooka straight into him, and the thought is at immediately that he's dead, right? That he's died. Um, right,
This
exactly.
is a Troutman line, by
A
the way. Yeah,
Troutman line, right?
yeah,
He
yeah.
definitely goes into that, right? And that we as the audience know that Rambo isn't dead. They're pretty quick into let you know that Rambo survives it. They don't really want to delve into a kind of mystery thing. They want you to kind of be like empathize with him. And now let's see how he gets out of this one. They think he's dead, or they assume he's dead. Troutman, they make like pretty clear through like a series of looks and a recognition of it that he's pretty sure that he's pretty confident that Rambo has survived it, but he doesn't share that to them. Though he does share like a disappointment that the government has lost a military asset, right, at a high level, and he suggests that the cops, you're not really thinking big picture here, right? Yeah, I know he's doing all this, but like Rambo is like one of a kind. The fact that you've engaged in this, you probably have cost this country more than you think.
There's one scene we forgot to mention that I just want to say a couple things about, which is like before they get to the scene where they go to the mine shaft, and they had to figure out where he was. And the way they do that is Rambo is taking a radio off a cop, and they keep trying to hail him, but like he's obviously not responding. He's just using the radio to listen to what they're doing. But then Troutman gets on the radio and starts doing the kind of like, using his call sign, which I can't remember, in Vietnam, and referencing his team
Right.
and all of this. And Rambo finally gets kind of like, he's sort of like, he's kind of having a PTSD, like, am I having a flashback kind of moment? And then he picks it up and he talks to Troutman, and then he's Rambo's like, I'm the last one left of the team. And Troutman says, no, there's still Delmar Berry is still there, which again, if we remember to the first scene, is the guy he goes to like visit and meets his mother, finds out he's dead. And he says, got himself killed in Nam, didn't even know it. Cancer ate him to the bone, down to the bone, which is very interesting because I was really trying to figure out whether the song came first or this movie did, because right around the same time, the Agent Orange song is like, maybe it's a folk song before this, but it's like starts to come up in recordings in like 1982, which is right as this film comes out. So I was like, maybe it was partially inspired by this, or I wasn't sure, on that, but it's very similar framing because that song has as the part of the chorus, they killed me in Vietnam and I didn't even know, right? Um, and anyways, just moving past that, Troutman says to him, "We can't have you out here wasting friendly civilians." And Rambo says, "There are no friendly civilians." And then he tries to kind of go back, and he's like, "They drew first blood, not me. They drew first blood," which is how we get the title of the film, right? So it's about the first blood is that the cops, they cut him first, and they messed him up first, and then everything I'm doing now is because they started the fight.
Yeah, and this becomes, I think, an important tie to the ending, the big ending speech. So, staying with Troutman, the scene after, Rambo has been, or one of the scenes after where Rambo has been possibly killed, and we see, Rambo break out of it heroically like rats. They really go. You get the Stallone grunts. It's kind of hilarious actually to a certain degree, and he able to like get himself out. There's a scene with Troutman and Teasel that I find to be like a centerpiece scene for the film, right? They're in a bar and Troutman's having a drink, right? And Teasel comes and meets him, and they have a conversation about Rambo, presuming that he's dead. Well, at least Troutman is making Teasel think that, they both think he's dead, while Troutman is probably pretty sure that he isn't, hoping that maybe he can get away, right? And they begin to talk about like the idea of like overstepping, right? And Teasel talks about how he really wanted to get Rambo, right? And like he really wanted to get this kid, right? It was something that he had to do. And Troutman admits to overstepping in Vietnam. Like he has this thing, he says, like, look, I'm sure there are things that me and Rambo had to do when we were there, but when in doubt, kill. And he admits this kind of logic that exists. And it's not performed in a way that, like I said before, is, oh man, that's bad. No, it's like, this is what the world requires, right? There are parts of the world that you don't understand that are just absolutely nuts and crazy. And this level of high violence, attention to a kind of rageful spirit that will, just cleanse the world of these nasty things must happen, right? It has to happen, right? Um, and I found that, really, 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 really interesting, because the other thing that Troutman admits, because Teasel asks him, like, would you have killed him? And he said, I would have had to have seen him first, right? Like, meaning that, like, he would have had to have evaluated, had like the dog he trained got too rabid, right? And if he got too rabid, he would have put him out of his misery, which is what actually happens in the book. But we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Since they rewrote the ending at the end after actually it's produced, which we'll talk about when we get there. I wonder if this is like a holdover too of like the original trajectory of the film.
Same.
Probably is.
Same.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the film like continues out with the action as like Rambo is able to kind of get out of the woods. He hijacks a military truck, right? Which has, that's not an M. What kind of gun is that? It's like a,
So
I
he
don't
gets so after that, yeah. So there's another chase. He steals
yeah.
this. He gets out. He takes the military truck. They find out. They see him do it, or they get the, I think, the reservist or whatever who's been booted out of it, and then they chase after him in the cop car again. Another
And
bad like
oh man, and this cop car is like swerving. Like the
yeah.
swerve on it is like dude had about 8 glasses of whiskey. It's surfing, it's just swerving across the road. It's just too much.
Yeah. But he gets an M60, which is, so it's a 60 caliber machine gun. It's a huge machine gun. Um, Backing up just a little bit before we go there, one thing I did want to just mention is that we just didn't mention, or maybe you mentioned it in passing, but he spelunks through the whole mine, like, and he gets some bands of cloth, he dips them in carrots, he finds a old like oil lamp and stuff like this, and like some old drums of like kerosene and stuff like that. He manages to make a torch. He goes all through this. He has like rats crawling all over him at one point, which kind of remind me of Indiana Jones stuff, which we will get to at some point in the 80s because we have to. But anyway, yeah, he escapes through that, and I just that scene is an interesting part of the movie. Like, I imagine there's some sort of metaphorical crap that's going on there about, going through the pits of hell or whatever. But like,
But that's what it references 100%. I mean,
yeah,
I do think the setting up of the Vietnamese as this hell and likening in that one quick scene, that hell being reminiscent, in some ways it's like a psychological suggestion that we're watching what he actually did in Vietnam, right?
right. And it's also this thing of them trying, especially in the book, he's trying to take tactics because he's an expert in guerrilla warfare. Well, who were really the experts in guerrilla warfare? It was the North Vietnamese army, right?
Right.
And so the the tunnels in Vietnam, you're absolutely right. Like that's what it is referencing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a thing that'll work better, especially in this era of Hollywood where they're really trying to do like psychological suggestion. It became really, really, important in these kind of movies, especially within the new Hollywood era, like the kind of like psychologically based character around like a lot of Freud stuff, whether you believe in it or not. That's what they were kind of operating on in these films. So, you know, he gets out of the woods and he goes into the city, right? Which, like, to me is a really, really important thing. Now, another thing we have not talked about is the fact that in this movie, I, I can't remember where it is. There are no women main characters or even minor supporting or like medium or small level. I don't. Is there a woman who speaks an actual line in the film?
I don't. So you said I thought that you found one at one point. I
No,
don't ever remember finding one. If there is, like maybe in the first scene where I don't remember this, but it might be where Dennehy's character Teasel is like coming out saying hello to people in the
that
morning
might
in
be
the
it.
town. If it is, but it's amazing to go a whole film and there's no female characters. Like certainly not a named credited woman in
No,
this film.
it's
It is all unadulterated, like, dick measuring contests. Like, it
right.
is a
Oh,
sausage
you get the
fest to
black
end all
woman at the
sausage fest.
beginning. You get the black woman
Yes,
at
right.
the mother.
That's
The
right. She's the
mother.
one
You get
woman
the
who talks.
mother.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
get the
yep.
mother.
That's right.
You get the grieving mother at the
Yep,
beginning of the film,
yep,
right? And then the rest
yep,
of it is
yep,
just male, you know?
yep,
Right.
yep,
It's
yep.
just
That's right.
male. And that's just what it is, right?
Yeah.
And so you get through this kind of male confrontation and he situates himself in the town, which has to be evacuated. Like he's saying, everyone get out. Because, like, I mean, Teasel has to say that. And that's, because that's being situated as like we're about to have World War, whatever, or Vietnam War happen here in this small town. So Rambo goes to a gas station and he uses, a setup with like the truck and it makes a big explosion in an effort to kind of pull Teasel out because it's really Teasel he then wants. He's like, at this point, like, I got to take this dude out. He's stepped to me, right? They drew first blood. He's not going to let up. I got to let this dude have it, right? So they go in this conflict. And it's funny. It's not like the final boss you see in a lot of other movies, like the final boss has like a somewhat, equal skill set. No, it's pretty clear that like Rambo is like so much higher level than Teasel, right? Like Teasel has no shot in this at all. And, they finally because he goes into a gun store, right? And he explodes the gun store, right? It draws Teasel out again, and they get into a confrontation in another building, right? And this is kind of where, the last kind of thing happens, and he wounds Teasel, right? If I remember correctly, right? He wounds him, right? And, Rambo at this point has won, right? He's won this fight, but outside there are state police kind of waiting for him. It's not going to end well from him. So then who enters? Troutman, right? You get Troutman kind of entering the sphere where Troutman can plead to Rambo about why he should kind of stop, let himself go, and we got to move on. And this is where I think like the core ideology of the film, and really the core ideology of a certain kind of thought around Vietnam and the Vietnam veteran, is revealed through a speech that Rambo actually gives. Do I have it here in front with me? Where is it? Oh, I have it
Hang
here.
on. I
Yeah, you
have
have
it,
it.
so I'll pull it up. Yeah.
Yeah, you pull it
Uh,
up. So I remember. So two things about this speech is, for the most part, it's pretty word for word to the script, but there's actually to me, the most telling line is actually included after the script. I don't know who added it, right? So Troutman says, "It's over, Johnny. It's over." Rambo, "Nothing is over. Nothing. You just don't turn it off. It wasn't my war. You asked me, I didn't ask you. And I did what I had to win for somebody who wouldn't let us win." So that line is not in the shooting script. And I did what I had to do to win for somebody who wouldn't let us win. I want to come
yeah.
back to that in a second, because that's also something that's used in Apocalypse Now. And I want to get
Mhm.
back to that in a minute. Then I come back to the world and see all these maggots, all those maggots at the airport protesting me, spitting, calling me a baby killer, and all kinds of vile crap. Who are they to protest me, huh? Who are they? Unless they've been me and been there and know what the hell they yelling about. Um, you want to just go through that part, or should we reread the whole thing?
Let's read the whole thing. There's a multiple
Yeah.
things we can unpack in it, but we can do the whole
Yeah,
thing
it was a
first.
bad time for everyone, Rambo. It's all in the past now. For you, for me, civilian life is nothing. In the field without a code of honor. You watch my back, I watch yours. Back here, there's nothing. Colonel Troutman, you're the last of an elite group. Don't end it like this. Oh, and then Rambo says, back there, I could fly a gunship. I could drive a tank. I was in charge of $1 million equipment. Back here, I can't even hold a job parking cars. Right.
Yeah.
And I have to
One
note the way Rambo, like the way Stallone says it, he's like so jumbled. It's kind of hilarious to see him try to emote. It's like very sloppy. Go ahead.
It is, but it's also like I think this is like one of the ways like that Stallone connects with people. Like it is like it's like the Rocky Stallone
Yeah.
in that kind of moment. Um
Yeah.
and there's it the one correction I would say is it's this line, it's supposed to say in the field we had a code of
Ah,
honor.
okay. We had a
You
code of
watch
honor.
your back, my back. Yeah, so it's like it's just saying like there's no code of honor out here. This is just chaos, you know.
But that's super important. Let's pause there, because then we can get back to the part. Let's talk about the first thing about like
Yeah.
the win, but then I want to talk about the part about his friend too. We can go back and re-reference it. So
Yeah.
one of the interesting things is that line about they wouldn't let us win. That is also something that's in Apocalypse Now. And this is not something that I picked up on until I was more mature, right? About like the Colonel Kurtz character in Apocalypse Now. And this is where you see John Milius, who will come up in our 80s stuff. This John Milius wrote some early versions of Apocalypse Now script. This idea that the reason why the Americans lost is because they were like not they were like dilettante army people, or like the soldiers were like not trained, they were lazy, right? And Kurt says if we trained our army better, we could like destroy all the Vietnamese in like half a second. Or this idea, kind of similar here in the book, that like they wouldn't let us win. Like we could have taken these people out, but you were all a little too polite, right? If you let us really rip, we would have won Vietnam like that, right? And it's such a dastardly like pro-imperialist line, and like it's in there, and like it really sticks out. And I find it amazing that it's not in the original script, and that they like literally felt the need to put that in there.
Yeah, totally. So I want to dig in a little bit
Yeah.
the spitting reference, right? Like this, the who are you to protest me? What did he say? He says, so going back to that, he said, yeah, he says, I see all these maggots at the airport protesting me, spitting, calling me a baby killer, and all kinds of vile crap. So I'm sharing from a book here that's called The Spitting Image. I have it in the show description. I'll read the whole title in a second because it has a longer title. But it deals with this idea, which is like very prevalent, that when Vietnam veterans came home from war, one, that they were literally spat on, which is like something that we'll get into in a second, but also that generally they came back to a society that that was against them, that saw them as um people weren't against the war, they were somehow against the troops or the veterans, right? And this is false, right? And so like there's the it's interesting because I think, again, going to Stallone, maybe reading some stuff contemporaries at the time, there are some different places in which this shows up. It doesn't actually really show up heavily until around 1989, which is a very interesting thing. So this movie also somehow participates in the manufacture of this image along with other films. And you do have this weird phenomena where you have veterans later on who articulate this, but there's so little evidence that anything like this ever actually occurred at all. And so here I'm going to share a little bit from this book, which talks about this and also talks about the cultivation with the Gulf War around this idea and how it then became kind of re-articulated as a strategy to where supporting military wars was not about how you felt about the war. So the Vietnam War anti-war movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement was against the policy. It was against the war. It was against the idea, right? It was not actually antagonistic to the troops. And actually, this is very well known in this. I'll go through some of the examples from this book, but there was a huge involvement of veterans in the anti-war movement because you usually did like a 1-year service and then came back out. And a lot of them were like, hey, we got to stop this. We got to get our boys home. We need to end this. It's a bad war, etc. Right. So there's a lot of that. There obviously were pro-war veterans. There were people like Rambo who like, hey, you just didn't let us do what we needed to do. Like that was a real attitude of certain veterans of the war. But there's also the reality that the people who were against the war actually didn't blame, especially because of the draft, they didn't blame the soldiers for the war. They blamed the state. They blamed the president. They blamed the country, right? Some of them had the analysis of monopoly capital, right? Like it wasn't the soldiers that were the cause of this, right? So this is really interesting. So anyways, I'm going to pull this up for a second here. Let me see if I can make it a little bigger. So the issue is that the memory of a large number of people, the anti-war movement came to be connected with the image of activists spitting on veterans. Moreover, what is conversationally safe is not the same as good science. The fact remains that there is scant as evidence that any person opposed to the Vietnam War engaged in this behavior, right? So like he goes through, he looks at all of the newspaper reports at the time. He looks at he shows there's no photographic evidence of it ever having happened. Um, there's no contemporaneous like reporting, etc. Right? So he's like, there's no evidence that during the Vietnam War period that this ever happened. There's nothing. And where they claim it all happened mostly is in San Francisco. But he's like, look, if you hear this is happening, like there would have been a million photographers there. He also goes through the fact that Vietnam veterans all were given a camera and were taking photos constantly, which was one of the ways that photos came out of Vietnam. And so they would have photographed if they were met with this kind of stuff, etc. He then goes into, which is, I think, really interesting, talking about the veterans who did face conflict in the United States, and they were the anti-war veterans. So he actually posits that if this ever happened, it was the Foreign Legion, it was the Korean War or the World War II vets who were spitting on the Vietnam veterans. And he goes through some instances where there were those kind of conflicts where, like, the older guard, both within the VA, the Veterans Administration, which does managed all the hospitals, like how their mistreatment of Vietnam veterans, as well as these other institutions like the American Foreign Legion, etc., that just didn't. Same thing. This is a connection to Rambo here a little bit, because you have this idea that Teasel, who's also a veteran, really has it out for Rambo for not embodying this thing. But in this speech, he's not putting it that he's now blaming the anti-war, the hippies, these people who spit on me, etc., right? And so it's a really nefarious thing, and I think Stallone probably believed it. But what's interesting about it is, even in 1982, there was like one or two references to this idea at that point. So it's pretty messed up, actually.
It makes you wonder then, really, or this could be a convincing argument to me, that Rambo helps push that narrative, because like,
It
I
absolutely does. I mean,
yeah,
that's one of the things that he argues in the book,
yeah.
is that Rambo is one of the he talks about Coming Home as well. He talks about,
Mm,
several of these films, but he definitely sees Rambo as part of this promotion of an image that then gets used by both Reagan, but certainly by Bush in his presidency, to kind of, then create this other narrative where then they have this yellow ribbon movement, which is all about, like, supporting our troops, which again, like, so this is really interesting shift that the US military and their propaganda goes around military, right? Is this idea that you need to support your troops, you need to support the people, right? And so it takes it from a material argument to a moral, humanistic one, where we're supposed to identify with the trauma and the difficulty of how hard this is to be at war. And that means we need to all line up behind this and support these people, provide moral support, be pro, yeah, I support the troops. Hell yeah, right? And it takes away completely the question of whether you should support the war, right? Because it's no longer about an argument for war. The war becomes a self-justification. We're at war, and you either support the troops or you don't, right?
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I saw this. I mean, I think a lot of us saw this firsthand with the post 9/11 invasion of Iraq, right? And people that I knew who were in it. And I remember having a conversation because I was at a protest, and someone says, "Well, I don't go to these protests because we have to support the troops, even though what might be going on is wrong." But they didn't make that choice, and you notice that this is what they're able to do. They're able to change the conversation, and films like this really are aids in changing the conversation, right? And one other thing, it's funny, I thought about the whole like baby killer, right? I think of that scene in Forrest Gump, right, where he goes to the Black Panther scene, which also has a whole other bunch of issues around with that scene. That scene really pisses me off on multiple levels. But what
For
is it?
when we get to Imperial 90s, yeah.
Exactly. But what is the first thing he says to Forrest Gump, who's a Vietnam vet? What's up with the baby? Who's the baby killer? Right. So they're pushing that narrative that this snot nose, I think he's supposed to be in SDS, this snot-nosed SDS guy who hangs out with Black Panthers who are just crazy, reciting rhetoric, would use that. So they're using that kind of narrative that these hippies were just these unrefined people who were just, or not even just hippies, the intelligentsia, the ones who were anti-war thinkers were, abusers and they just, unrefined, and they would shit on the veterans, and we should support them. You're muted.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Just yeah, I don't want to spend too much more time on this, but it's just good. This book, like, he goes through so much. He goes through, like, certainly J. Edgar Hoover and military intelligence would have been paying attention to stories of spitting. There's nothing in those archives about it. Police and court records, he's like, certainly somebody would have been arrested, right, if you were doing this. Like, you can't just be spitting on people, etc. He talks about the Special Committee on Demonstration Observation was established by the Bar Association of the City of New York in the 1970s. It documented, it sent members of the bar all over, basically as like legal observers, right, to all the different protests, etc. And there's all that. And then he goes through all the news reports, etc. One of the things that's also worth noting is that there's just so little even anti-troop sentiment. And this is also reflected by troops themselves, where, like, I think he says up here that 6% over all stories over a 6-year period could be construed as antagonistic behavior by the anti-war movement against GIs or veterans. So that's very small. He also talks about at one point, yeah, here it is, 75% of Vietnam veterans polled. This is in 1971, so right at the heart of the anti-war movement, disagreed with the statement, those people home who opposed the Vietnam War often blame veterans for our involvement there. 99% of veterans polled described their reception by close friends and family as friendly, while 94% said their representation by people their own age who had not served was friendly. Only 3% of returning veterans described their reception as not at all friendly, right? So again, like, not only is the not literally spitting on thing true at all, but even if you read it metaphorically as, like, they hated us, they treated us like crap, like, there is this element again that the film speaks to of older generations and pro-war people's animosity to anti-war veterans, or to people that they think just didn't quite live up to this macho, pro-country and patriotic idea. But even that is pretty small among how people, like, really, well, that part might be bigger, but this is dealing with, particularly in this book, how the anti-war movement was related to the military. He also goes on to also talk about, like, veterans against the Vietnam War and all this kind of stuff of that. Actually, one of the things, this is interesting, he actually posits that part of this shift too was the right trying to also recapture, because he says in Vietnam, a lot of the veterans were pro-left. So this is an interesting thing too, of the reality of, he thinks this is part of a strategy to make being pro-war patriotic, but also a conservative thing. Not pro-war is not the right way, but to say that the left, painting an antagonism between the left and people who had been drafted, right? Like that, because that's what the real thing was in the United States during Vietnam War. And so, and then you also get, I think, a shift that becomes out of this, where more right-wing people are pro-military. More right-wing people are more likely to serve, right, in the military post-draft, etc. Right. And so it's a very interesting in terms of the shift of the political landscape. And obviously, with an anti-imperialist analysis, we could say, like, we're against this thing totally, but that's also understanding it as a system, right? As, like, this is monopoly capitalism, and this is how monopoly capitalism functions through these expressions of militarism against alternatives, which Vietnam was trying to build, right? And so, yeah, it's an interest. There's a lot of elements that's going on there.
So there's a great short story by a writer named Henry Dumas called "Strike and Fade." Henry Dumas was a great poet and short story writer. Was murdered by police. One of those people they say who was crazy, and then the police, but it was obviously a police killing of a black man. But Strike and Fade is about a black soldier coming back from Nam and hooking up with some friends, right? And he basically tells them that the war is bullshit. It's imperialist, and basically advocates that, they all learn to basically start revolution in the United States, right? But what's interesting, it supports kind of two things you bring up, and this was written in that period. The first thing that it supports is they all, when he comes home, they're all like, "Hey man, how you doing?" Right? And like they're loving and hugging him and making sure he's okay. But at the other end, that he was going to go left. That like what the war taught him was that America is not on the right side of things, and that we need to basically start a guerrilla war here in the U.S. And it's like it's deep. It's a deep story.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna play it, but I put in the show description. I played it on the Freedom Archives one we did, but they did a great interview with Geronimo G. Jaga, right? Geronimo Pratt, formerly
Yeah,
known. And he talks about it being deployed in Vietnam and then coming home, and then they deploy them to Detroit, and how there was so much love for the Detroit Rebellion amongst the troops that they had deployed to Detroit that they started arming them. And so it's a really good illustration of like one of the things that's like totally occluded by this narrative is that, and obviously he becomes part of the Black Liberation Army and so on, right? As did, others. I think Donald Cox is behind me, his book, Mike Hamlin. Like, so there's a lot of people who become involved in revolutionary organizations that use the military skills that they learn from this type of conflict and really try to like bring the war home in certain ways. Um, and yeah, I mean, this narrative, that's also the thing. It's like also shifting what the discussion is of bring the war home, of like, you know, uh and
exactly.
of the Vietnam veterans who actually had gun battles with police, right? And so on. So
Right,
anyway.
right, exactly, exactly. So another thing in the monologue, and I won't read it, but is so he starts off in this kind of like angry like disposal of everyone, right? He's like pissing off, who he's pissed off at. And then of course in the natural kind of melodramatic way, he has his emotional break, right? And his emotional break story is this story about, being at a bar in Vietnam and a Vietnamese kid with a shoe shine box coming up to his friend and, basically saying, we're going to shine your shoes and so forth, but it ends up being a bomb. Right. And and this kid comes up, this kid's carrying a shoe shine box and he says, shine, please shine. I said, no, no. He kept asking, yeah. And Joey said, yeah. And I wanted to get a couple of beers and the the box was wired and he opened up the box, fucking blew his body all over the place. And he's laying there and he's fucking screaming and there's pieces of him all over me. Right. So he has this huge emotional break. Right. And it's clear, you're supposed to just really emote with the veteran who had to watch, his friend die and, the parts all over him. It's very graphic in like its description and like Stallone can like barely like speak in coherent words. It's like, he's really like really breaking down. And, watching that scene, I mean, I have a multiple experiences, right? As a person who's a bit more mature, like if you're watching it and you're not thinking on these levels, you could totally be coaxed into saying, man, I mean, that's just really horrific what they had to go through. But of course, what it does is it centers that the greatest kind of sufferer or violence within that conflict, right? I put those in quotations, were these American soldiers, right? That even a kid came up and tried to kill us and you adding this to the idea that's probably inherent with a lot of Americans that even if it was maybe a bit of an overstep, like American intervention has some just elements to it at the very core. Some people think it's completely just, right? If you're anti-communist, it's completely just, right? If you're thinking that, communism spreading around the planet is just a bad thing, especially we're in the 80s and we're in the Cold War. If you believe that it was a completely just act, even if, overstepping did happen. But the people who suffered the most were the soldiers. And I'm watching it and I'm going, so we're never going to get, even though Troutman admits to overstepping and killing people, the only real graphic interpretations of violence that we see and hear is what happens to American soldiers, right? And it really sets up that the people who are the victims of this conflict were the American soldiers, which really becomes the theme of 80s Vietnam work, from Platoon. I mean, that is Platoon 100%, right? They are the victims. Even when they do like their fake Miley massacre moment in Platoon, right? It's not even as emotionally it's they have to have, I don't want to go too much in Platoon, it's a bad side of the soldiers who did it. Like Defoe doesn't want to do that. Elias in the film, and I think we actually have to do Platoon. I think
We do, yeah, for
I think
sure.
we have to do that film because it tries to be like the more liberal, like nuanced version, but it's still bullshit in that
Yeah.
way.
Well, and Oliver Stone is like, he's a veteran himself, and
Right.
he's like purportedly someone on the left, right? And so there's like this, yeah, I know, real shifty character. But yeah, no, we have to do that. Yeah, so I agree with all of that. Another thing that's like totally absent. We talked about this, but like, you know, there's no discussions of fragging, there's no anti-war veterans, like all of these things are removed, which are important to talk about. um so this ending, so let's talk about the ending a little bit. So yeah, in the original,
The book, yeah.
in the book, basically Rambo and Teasel die, and in the original version of the script, Rambo commits suicide in the end. And Stallone really, I think, along with some of the other actors who moved out of it, really didn't want to do that. And he cites, so in, if people watch Sly on Netflix, which is this little documentary on him, he talks about this whole scene. And he talks about, one, he says the speech is him jumbling together stories from like 20 different veterans into one. Now it makes me think, like, did he read some kind of bad book, of like some compilation that was like very right wing, whatever, pulling together different stories and like kind of putting it in? Like, that's certainly possible. I don't know how much I kind of buy the legitimacy, particularly because of that spitting thing, which just wasn't really in the discourse at that time. Um, But he also says, he cites this thing. He says, at the time, we were losing 20,000 vets a month to suicide. I don't want to be a part of it. I don't. And so the reason that it actually gets changed is they take it to like some test audience, and the audience hates the ending. And so then they're like, bring Stallone back, and they reshoot the ending to get the ending that we have. But that 20,000 vets committing suicide a month is really interesting because it's totally false. Like, first of all, it's a huge number. Like, if you imagine that would be, you know, what, 140,000 a
That would be
year,
the
right?
biggest mass suicide in history.
Right,
Period.
right. Yeah, like it's a ridiculous number. And he says it. Now there were, interestingly, some contemporaneous reports at the time that exaggerated. So they said something like 50,000 had committed suicide between the end of the war in 1982, or like in the early years of the 1980s. So there was definitely some stuff going on in the media and whatnot about this kind of phenomenon. And I don't want to diminish, a lot of veterans of Vietnam did commit suicide. Like, it's quite a high number. I think it might even be something like 90,000 over the full life of the war, which is really high. I don't know that it's quite that high, but it's a pretty high statistic. Um, but in that period, I think it's something like 9,000 over like a 5-year period or something like that. You folks can look into it. There's like some conflicting reports, but there's definitely been some research done to debunk these larger numbers, which was also a theme in the 80s. Like there was also the way over inflation of how many kids were being kidnapped in that period too, which led to the whole like moral panic around like, and they tied it to like sexual deviancy and all of this kind of stuff. Brad Renfro wrote a really good book about that called Stranger Danger. But anyways, it was kind of a thing that happened in the 80s too. And I think it's also just a product of like not that great of like science and data tracking. And so then people extrapolate these numbers that just become really ridiculous. But anyways, that also is a myth. And I think that's interesting that that contributed to how they did the ending and him wanting to make an ending where even though Rambo has, shot up however many cops, has killed at least one. And well, although he really didn't, but like the state wouldn't care about that, right? They would still blame the death of Art Galt on him, certainly. And he gets away and he gets away. There's an implication that he might be going to jail, right? But he goes away with Troutman. And there is a kind of, I think, feeling of, well, at least, he gets out alive. And there's a little bit of a kind of, like nobody takes him out for all that he's done. And he's not like, jumped on and beaten by all the people who are there or anything like that. And of course, then we will see him reemerge in Rambo, which is this is one thing I hate about this series is the numbering, because it's like First Blood and then there's Rambo, but then sometimes it's called Rambo 2,
Or
even though
Rambo
it's
is First Blood Part 2.
right. It has all of these things. There's different names, and then you get Rambo 3, but it's like we didn't have a Rambo 2. And so there is a
Yeah.
whole weird thing about that. But it's a really interesting kind of like by Rambo, there's kind of a rebranding and, you know, a bigger push even behind the film around this blockbuster action, just nakedly pro-military kind of thing that I'm sure we will get to later on in this series. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so and then also to mention that the book, Troutman kills Rambo. And that because Troutman in that kind of scene, I don't know if that scene's in the book, but in the scene in the movie where he talks about he have to evaluate him. In the book, when Troutman sees Rambo, basically it's like because he's in this new civilization and they had to train him, to become such a high level killer, he can't function in this society. So Troutman basically takes him out of his misery. Like he kills the rabid dog, right? So the reason why Kirk Douglas turned down being Troutman is because they changed that. And I have a quote here from Kirk Douglas. He said, "I thought it would be better dramatically if my character realized what a Frankenstein monster, a moral killer, and menace to society he has created and kills Stallone," talking about Troutman. If they listened to me, though, there would have been no Rambos. They would have lost $1 billion, which when we get to 2, because it's after 2 where the action figures become a thing in the cartoon, he's right in that way. They were able to then franchise the film and step into what would become the kind of toy industry attached to movies and cartoons that Star Wars kind of helps kick off. But then things like G.I. Joe, and there's a marriage that begins to happen. So Rambo, some of it is opportunistic. Like, I don't want to say that they saw this coming, though they did think about the idea of franchising the character. They have said that they didn't want to kill the character because they thought they could do more movies. It was something that was in their head where they're going to go into this like super thing of him going in. I mean, the second one is just crazy because he goes back to Vietnam, which we'll get to when we get to the movie. It's just like absolutely nuts. But
It's a Stallone thing too. Like he
yes,
said that he again says it in that Netflix doc, but he loves sequels. Like he believes in sequels because he's like, you can't really tell enough of a story in one movie. You need to keep it going. And also he sees it as a kind of challenge to be able to like write sequels and keep them going. And so obviously, he does have the Rocky films, which have a ton of, and they keep coming back, right? Now you have Creed spinoff. But then you had this with Rambo, which also gets a resurgence again in like I think 2010s or so,
Yeah.
or late 2000s. Um,
The
and then
Expendables
the
now.
Expendables, right? Yeah, and so it's a thing too for Stallone where he probably also was kind of like, I don't want to kill this guy off. Also, like that's the thing is like I'm not sure it was about the suicide thing for you. So much of it was like I want to preserve this property for myself. You know.
Yeah, because he's really operating in that thing in Hollywood, right? Like you had pointed out earlier, this could possibly be something, and it was. It was the fact that he was able to define a second character was able to kind of position himself in Hollywood. And I mean, and we'll talk. I think in Rocky 4 and the other Rambos, the conversation will, you know, even broaden with Stallone. Is just his patriotism. I find it really, I mean, it's strange, to think that the ultimate patriot would be, Sylvester Stallone from Philly, but he is in many ways one of the most patriotic actors there is in creating a kind of patriotic vision of the American person, right? This patriotism is really, really heavy in his work and his ideology. It's wild.
And I don't want to get into like psychoanalyzing him too much, but he talks about this quite a bit in the Sly documentary where he actually says Rambo was my father, right? And he has this whole thing. I mean, he has a really contentious, violent relationship with his father. His father is like very violent to him. And he describes it a lot as like physical, right? And so this is another interesting thing is that he leans into these, he wants to be his model for himself is like Hercules Unchained, this film from I think the 1960s. And so he wants to be really jacked and he wants to be like, shirtless and and this of course then does fit really well when he gets into like the action figure kind of like and so he and Arnold Schwarzenegger I'd say are the two biggest like properties kind of as people in the 1980s as this kind of action hero type of person personified. And there are others we'll talk about. We're going to talk about Chuck Norris. We're going to talk about Van Damme. I think there's others, but I think also, Stallone is maybe of all of them, like kind of comes across as this American working class immigrant. Like, he sort of fits into these things. Like, Schwarzenegger, there's the whole thing, and we'll talk about it with different films of him, of like, sometimes he's East German and he's like a defector. Like, there's these kinds of things that are going on. So it's like an anti-communism that's built into him. Van Damme, also European, like, and then, Norris, I think is an interesting one, but I just don't think he's also very not that Stallone's a great actor, but Stallone's a much better actor than Chuck Norris. Like Chuck
Yeah,
Norris, I
he has
just don't
personality.
has
Chuck Norris is literally personality less,
yeah, he's
right?
just so bland.
Yeah, he can't really
Um,
do anything.
and I think actually of all of the kind of action figure people like this, the action heroes, Stallone, well, he lacks range to a certain extent. Like, I still think he's maybe the most believable in certain ways as like, like Schwarzenegger is a terrible actor. Like I was
Yeah.
watching, and we'll get to it, but I was watching Commando, and I'm like, what the hell is this movie? I mean, and Stallone can like kind of pull some of this stuff off. Less so, I think, with the later Rambo movies, but certainly with the Rockies and this film, like there's a lane that he has that he's actually pretty good in that lane.
I mean, he has like a charm and a personality, and you could see him also wanting to work at being an actor. So like he'll like try things, right? and he's always big into reinventing himself, right? So he'll do the Rocky stuff, the Rambo stuff, then he'll do something like Tango and Cash later. Remember that movie where he tries to act like the refined guy? Like Kurt Russell is the rough around the edges one. No, Stallone's the refined guy who reads the Wall Street Journal and so forth and so on. He's constantly trying to do it. Whether he's good at it or not is a whole other thing. And part of the reason why he got Rocky, they said, was his charm, right? He had like a naturalistic charm to him, right? And you're right, because the other actors, people like Norris, which is, we'll get to that. Like, Cannon, when they tried to really launch him, struggled because he wasn't really that appealing, right? All they could really market with Norris was his martial arts ability, which is why when they found Van Damme, they were so excited because they were like, oh, this guy's a bit more charming, right? And he can fight in the same way, So, yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of the 80s is wild with this stuff. Whole lot of stuff.
The only other things I'll say about the film is I do think that there are some real things, like, because it's like, obviously it resonates. It is a blockbuster. It's not quite the blockbuster that the later Rambo films would be, but it's successful for sure. And other than the Rocky films, a lot of Stallone's other films from this period are not successful at all. And so I do think that there's this, the reality is that Vietnam veterans were like kind of betrayed by the government, by, again, like older, like more pro-war folks, like, and so there is this kind of, there's something it taps into there. The PTSD thing, like a ton of Vietnam veterans did have PTSD. Again, this is totally separate from, obviously, the worst aspect of the Vietnam War was the war on Vietnamese people, right? And all of the war crimes, all of the horrendous stuff, the 2 million that are, somewhere in that range that were killed, the other wars that are less talked about, in Laos and, Cambodia and so on. And then Indonesia, which is not like, so there's like a whole massive dirty war on all of Southeast Asia, of which Vietnam is a part. And, when you look at that whole war in totality, actually, unfortunately, from US imperialism's perspective, even though they lose in Vietnam, it's pretty successful. Like, they're able to thwart a lot of the kind of communist, nationalist success of that region, to be able to like totally delink and determine its own future. There's some states that do try communism, like, but other than Vietnam, which still has sort of held on, with its contradictions and all of that, like, a lot of them were not successful in doing that. And so that's one thing to say, that obviously we do need to locate, like, that the real victim here, or the real tragedy, is what happened there. But having said that, like, we do live in America, and there were these veterans who came home and they weren't treated well. Like, there was a big denial of the kind of PTSD stuff that they were dealing with. And so I think this film does successfully, like, kind of resonate on that level. I think the problem is that it begins with some of these, like, with that monologue and stuff, to shift also the kind of blame of these things in dangerous ways, where the left and their like anti-war stance, their anti-imperialist stance, becomes blamed for like how veterans feel about their reception at home, which wasn't actually the case in real time. And I think that's a but it then becomes a kind of this, over the course of the 80s, and I'm sure it'll come up in other films we talk about, it takes on a force of its own, right? And so then you get this, rather than, America has always been an empire, but in theory, right, between the left and the right, like, there should be some kind of debate about what a proper position of being an American is, right? Like, I mean, and I don't want to go to, because I don't want to get into patriot socialism and all those kind of things that I'm not really into at all. But I do think that, you know, there's a right to have a voice in national policy. And there was a possibility, right? Especially in this period, I think, especially around Vietnam, where there could have been a revolution potentially. There could have been a real shift in what the country was like. And so this is also a part of writing the left out of that, or blaming them for a kind of, you know, I mean, I don't want to say anti-Americanism is a bad thing, because I don't really think that it is in this point. But rather than saying, look, they wanted a voice on what being an American should mean to some extent, like writing all of that and just saying, no, they just hate the troops, they just made it our lives miserable. And because it makes you feel, because there's that last scene that makes you really, like Stallone sniveling and crying and sobbing and drooling and all this stuff, and talking about his like PTSD experiences. It's like, oh, like that's the guy that we need to support, those folks. And so it's a very nefarious thing, because on one level, like, yes, the state has a responsibility for these people that it drafted and threw into war, that it needs to give them medical care and, take after them and stuff. And it actually didn't do a good job of that, right? And also, police and, there's all these. So there's certain elements of the antagonisms that are real, but the narrative shifts the blame to the left, which is totally absent from the film.
And this is, to me, where Troutman is actually the most Trojan horse pernicious character, because if you watch the end of the film, he walks off with Troutman, and they play the song, right? And I think like the final like shot still is like Troutman and him together, and there's a way that you could have made this film where you expose that Troutman actually is the criminal, right? And then Troutman could stand in for the state, right? Where you could say, look what you made here, right? And you did this to these people. And that maybe even Rambo would recognize it, because Rambo never actually goes, you did this to me, right? He never actually names it. And then by 3, he's rescuing Troutman from Arab terrorists, right? So it's like a paternalism. They create a kind of paternal, not a kind of, they create a paternal like roadway, saying the left doesn't respect you, the police don't respect you, the military does. We will support the troops. And if you want to support the troops, support the cause of someone like a Troutman. So when we ask you over this next decade, because some war is going to pop up. Something's going to happen in the next decade because of all the reds and all of the national struggles that are happening. You're going to have to support us, right? And it's a paternalism ramp. Like it's kind of ironic to watch them like literally walk off together on a ramp, like on like a street. And that's like the end. I mean, the lyrics are terrible. Like, it's a long road when you're on your own, and it hurts when you tear your dreams apart, and every new town just seems to bring you down. Trying to find a peace of mind can break your heart. I mean, like, could you be
I wanted
more
to
on the
know
nose?
If Stallone wrote those lyrics. I really wanted to know. Maybe Frank Stallone wrote those lyrics.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah. Last thing I'll say on this point is that, there's the whole discussion of like Vietnam syndrome, or of this like idea that post Vietnam that we couldn't congeal, like, US politics and patriotism to do a big war anymore, like we had in World War I and World War II and Korea. Again, like, all these are terrible, terrible things. But like, this is a ruling class and government obsession of like, we need to figure out how to get back there. And I think it's just interesting because Stallone then, even though he is this kind of individual, like, do a lot of, like, he plays this very nefarious role in promoting ideological frameworks to get back to, like, okay, when the Gulf War pops off. And this is not to say, like, obviously the US is involved in all kinds of like dirty wars in the 1970s, dirty wars in the 1980s, and we will talk about those as well. But the idea of something big scale, we need to be able to like get our whole military to do things. And it really wasn't until, I mean, there's the Gulf War, and then there's the post 9/11 stuff that you really see that return to the place where it is now. And even still in the United States at this point, like there's the whole like they prefer proxy wars to having to kind of like fight the wars themselves. And the draft is gone, and there's all this kind of stuff that becomes a part of the legacy of Vietnam. But I think in this era of the 80s, it's another reason why it's such an important decade is that there's all this holiday work that Hollywood work, I think, that's trying to create the on ramp back to big scale militarism that the ruling class feels like it absolutely needs for its imperial project.
Yeah, and I think this actually makes me. I mean, because we have to, it'll come up when we watch certain films. I mean, because of the nuclear war thing that kind of like hovers over the 80s as well. And, the idea that the generation of the 80s was raised under this idea of the certainty of impending conflict, right? Almost like like it's a certainty it's going to happen between the USSR and the USA. It's just a matter of how destructive it would be. So the only way for us to ensure us winning is if you support us in how we maneuver, right? And yeah, you'll see it throughout the movies. Yeah, I mean it's pretty wild. It is
Right
wild.
on. All right, I think we'll just go through some of these comments in the
Yeah,
chat and get out of here because I know we're running
we
up
hit.
on 3 hours. We just Mtume and I do this when we get
I
together.
know it's a lot.
All right, so Mtume is gonna ruin my whole childhood. Just skewer Hills Cop, and bury me. We're headed for it, Eric. I'm
And look,
sorry.
I'll be the first one to admit that I enjoy Beverly Hills Cop, but it is propaganda at its most finest. And it's interesting how they're able to make it work psychologically. I mean, I want to go through. We definitely should do it, but there's a way that they're able to work it, and it's really, really slick.
Yeah, and agreed. And again, as I said earlier, I liked this movie, and I still do. I probably will still watch this movie, but I going through this, and that's why I'm so glad to be doing this series with you and with all the
Same.
guests we're gonna bring through. Is like it does help. Like okay, like let's really like because I think the things that we like are often the most dangerous within like Hollywood propaganda or movies,
Yeah.
but they are propaganda, right? And so it's like,
Mhm.
okay, what are the things that you like about it? And again, it's that always saw it as like an anti-cop movie. I saw it as like an underdog movie. I saw it as, all this cool stuff that Stallone's doing in it, you identify with him but like that is what creates the space where all the messages that are coming in that are bad
Yeah, it's part of the
are
on ramp,
entering
right?
because
It.
it's like, oh, I like this movie. And it's the same thing. So there'll be, I think as we go through this, both them to me and I will say, like, there's some of these movies we like, and there are some of these movies that we just hate. And we'll do both because I think it's important to do both.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, they didn't understand why we loved Rambo. First of all, I also will say I don't like the other Rambo movies at all. I think
Mhm.
they're like bad as film and really obvious propaganda. Um, but I will say the other Rambo films were what was much more popular with my peers growing up.
100%. I mean, Rambo 2 was like on in my house. My dad watched it.
Mhm.
It was like on.
Um, and we will do RoboCop. We're gonna do that's
I
on the
like
list.
RoboCop. I think RoboCop. I mean, RoboCop has a primary contradiction of just around cops and unionization, but I do think RoboCop. I mean, Verhoeven's an interesting guy, and Verhoeven's a very interesting guy. Starship Troopers and Total Recall. He's an interesting guy who actually has politics that are a lot more aligned with us.
Um, Cox's Making Revolution. Yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
Field Marshal Donald Cox, again from the Black Liberation Army. I purposely had this up today because I wanted also different representations of veterans than what you get in this film. I, so I think that we should do Back to the Future. It's such a huge. We will
Yeah,
also do things that are just like massive, products, and certainly
yeah.
there's a lot of anti-communism in Back to the
Right, and
Future.
Back to the Future's like main early plot point is him making a nuclear, trying to deceive. What are they? Are they? What
So
are
yeah,
they?
they're Libyans.
They're Libyan, right?
It has to do with Libyans and nuclearization, which is also,
Right.
yeah. I mean that's, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, which is like a lot like right now if they made a movie about Iran and that like in this exact moment,
Right.
that's yeah. Um Top Gun and F-16 sales had a huge impact on Pakistani youth culture in the 1980s and 1990s. I think Top Gun will be one that we
Ooh.
have to do. Um, Iron Eagle with Lou Gossett Jr.
Iron
That was
Eagle
on your list.
is definitely on the list. That's definitely happening. Yeah, that
Yeah.
movie. Oof, I mean, that's another one that played in my house. And when we talk about Lou Gossett, it'll get pretty deep. How he was used as a military figure for Black people, and really for white people also, and for America. It's like a really interesting thing with Lou Gossett Jr. from Officer and a Gentleman on.
Oh yeah, Officer and a Gentleman. Is that an 80s movie? It is, right?
Yeah,
So
no,
we
I think
probably
it's
have
like
to do that.
it's 81. Yeah, I mean, and that's the movie that he wins the Oscar for. I mean, we should definitely do that.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even think about that.
I didn't either. So Rambo 3, we will definitely do. The funny thing about that is like everybody that I'm like, hey, do you want to be a guest? Like the first thing they say is, oh yeah, let me come on and do Rambo 3. I want to talk about the Mujahideen movie. Like, so
That's
maybe
funny.
maybe we'll get a bunch of people together
A
to do
round
that one or
table on
sooner or
that
later.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, all right. Um, this is interesting, and we probably do need to bring it in. Maybe we'll do Rocky 3 at some point. We could talk
Ooh.
about the W because that includes Hulk Hogan. Yeah, I mean it's an interesting
That's an
there
interesting thought. Yeah.
yeah,
Sergeant Slaughter. And I remember, I mean, this goes into the 90s when Sergeant Slaughter joined. He ended up supporting with Iraq. He ended up becoming like Saddam Hussein's like right hand man or something. Some weird thing that they did.
was
Remember
it him
that?
or oh yeah, it was Sergeant Slaughter.
It
Yeah,
wasn't Sergeant
yeah,
Slaughter, and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
when they made Hulk Hogan into an American hero.
yeah. Yeah, that's in the Vince McMahon documentary. Yeah. A
Uh,
lot of Vince McMahon's vision for the WWF was that cultural idea of righteous violence. I see
mm,
connections to muscular Christianity in it. Yeah, I mean the muscle thing in the 80s is something that we don't really get here, but you get a little bit of it here because there are these scenes where Rambo has to take his shirt off and stuff like that. But like it gets with Schwarzenegger and
I mean,
Stallone, like it goes
this
crazy.
all you got to remember is what's memed now. It's that Predator, Carl Weathers and Schwarzenegger, two arms, grabbing each other, Dylan, and they put the arm together and you see them, muscle off, right? The idea of the muscularity of the Imperial Project, and that's how you kind of get people into it. Muscles become an example of like strength and but all encompassing strength, right? Like it's not just that you have muscles, you have the ability to like do anything.
Yeah, right on. Folks are naming a ton of movies in the
Yeah.
chat, which I won't be able to get to all of them. But
Yeah.
and also, I mean, we may do all of them, but I'm not going to name all of them right now. But
Yeah.
also, some of the ones people are naming are in the 90s, and I think eventually we will work our way there. But we started this and we had like 10 movies or something like that, and
Yeah.
we're like, oh, there's so much that we have to
Yeah,
do.
because there's even
They
movies.
Live.
So this
We
is the
definitely
thing.
want to do They Live.
So this is the thing that there are some movies that I also think. I mean, I think They Live is a great movie because I quite like John Carpenter. And then there are movies that like have interesting reads, even though they might not be left or something like that. Like there's a movie that I definitely want to do called To Live and Die in LA by Friedkin. And Friedkin was a weird guy in terms of his ideas, but that movie is very honest about about the kind of way the militarization, like the hawk kind of mentality, and how he exposes how that hawk mentality exists within kind of American carceral and like surveillance systems. He's not someone who he was not someone who believed in the destruction of America, but he was definitely someone who liked to be kind of honest about it in his movies. So I think that's a movie to kind of like engage with that I think is really interesting.
Right on. ZZ Lion Dad, quote, he could eat things that made a billy goat puke, regurgitation and rechewing of food is a process known as chewing the cud. I always took that as a biblical reference. Respect enjoying the series. First of all, thank you
Interesting.
for the contribution. One thing I forgot to mention up front, which I should have, is that because we're doing this collaboratively, we're still trying to figure out like how we want to, do that. But both of our Patreon links are in the show description. Mtume also has a great series of like study reflections on the How to Read Donald Duck book that we talked about last week. And, yeah, so anyways, you can support both of us via
Hmm.
Patreon, but we may figure out a way that people could kind of centralize for this specific project. So, anyways, thank you for the support. Yeah, one thing I wanted to clarify, because my comments there were a little bit jumbled, is yeah, it's definitely not, you don't want to enter into that position of like the working class should support certainly the military project, right?
Yeah.
Um, you know, or should we be responsible for them, not the state that used them as cannon fodder in the first place? I mean, that's an interesting, discussion. I do think that the state does bear responsibility for the people that it does do that. But obviously, we're against the United States state project in general and think that we need something completely different. So, maybe that'll come up in future discussions more. But I wasn't making the argument that like it's like, oh, left was pro-military and right wasn't, and now right's pro-military and left isn't. It's not so much that as the fact that there was a lot of political overlap between people who were being drafted into the military and they had pro-left views, and also because they were anti-war even though they were in the war, and there was an anti-war movement on the outside. So when they came home, they moved right into that, right? And so there is an importance to that history that is now quite different. And I think this film and kind of the 80s in general are a part of a kind of process
Yeah.
of which the right figures out ways to kind of get around that. And I think that's something that's we do have to grapple with of, you know, the way that they've now painted the left as being not just anti-war, but anti-soldier. And even within the left, there's a lot of this discussion still, which maybe we'll get to in later episodes, of, well, should we let veterans into our movements now because they have served empire, right? And I'm just saying that that conversation was totally different in the 1960s and 70s because they were like, no, like bring these folks home. If they're on our side now, they're on our side and they have skills that we can use in our communities, etc. And I just think that that is an important discussion. Um, all right. He-Man was so butch, he didn't even have nipples. I think we do have to do Masters of the Universe, actually, the
Oh
Dolph Lundgren
man.
film.
Oh man.
Um,
Yeah.
and then, yeah, Police Academy movies. I think we probably do have to do at least one
Yeah, and
of
like
them, maybe.
in
Yeah.
general, some of these comedies too. Like we were doing like
Hmm.
action films first, but then like movies like Jewel of the Nile, Romancing the Stone. Some of these movies that the way they talk about peripheral countries and the third world and things like that, the way they kind of deal with that is really, really pernicious and helps aid the project just as much as like the military movies. Treasure hunters able to go and steal things, which we covered a lot in like in the How to Read Donald Duck series.
Yeah. We're gonna fight about this idea that Indiana Jones is anti-fascist, I think, because we will be doing Indiana Jones. And certainly he fights Nazis, which is great. But I think we will get into again, similar to this movie, how maybe participating in a conflict that we can all get behind becomes a way of sneaking in a whole bunch of really messed up stuff that we should all be opposed to, right? And I think Indiana Jones is a prime example of this.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to get too far ahead. All right. And then somebody asked if we're doing Glory. This is one that we've been talking about. I think we do have to do it. It's going to be one of the probably harder conversations, I think, in terms of a film. But I do think that there's some nefarious
Yeah,
you
I'm down
know,
to do
stuff
it
going on with Glory.
because I said it here. I do not agree with Adolph Reed's read of that movie. He has a very like high praise of that film, and I find Glory to be very problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, we'll get,
We'll get there
you can
though.
cancel us now, but you got to come back and listen to why we say that.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Much appreciated, everybody. I think it is more than time to
Yeah.
let you all go.
Yes. Yeah.
And to me, this was great. Anything you want to say as we close out?
No, I mean, I'm looking forward to next week with another Stallone. We'll do Nighthawks. That's going to be really interesting. I haven't seen it in quite a while. I'm looking forward to watching it again. Rutger Hauer. That's very interesting movie.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. It's lesser known. It's a
Yeah.
Stallone movie from the year before this. It's also not one that he like holds up in his own kind of canon of my films. It's also interesting. I mean, I think this is one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through this. And this movie, to some extent, is an example of it. But Nighthawks is definitely an example of like certain movies that continue to be big on streaming services that, get brought back out. I mean, First Blood has had a lot of lives, but like there's it's just interesting which films from the 80s they keep like bringing out and which ones they decide uh are not, because having Sylvester Stallone in a cop movie, like you might think, well, like that's something that a lot of people would watch just because they
Mm-mm.
love Stallone and, um, but looking forward to that. Can't wait to break it down with Hiram. And
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking forward to
definitely
that.
looking forward to that.
Yeah.
All right. All right, man. I'm gonna get us out of here. Thanks
All right,
again.
y'all. Peace, folks.
Peace.